Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. I recognize the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to introduce through you and to all members of this Assembly a number of individuals that we have in your gallery, Mr. Speaker. First of all, a number of advocates with CF Canada that have joined us here today. And specifically, Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to mention we have Janae Dawson with us today. Her son Alex was not able to make it, Mr. Speaker, from the community of Rosetown. And with Janae is Kimberly Evans and her 10-year-old daughter, Cassidy Evans, Mr. Speaker. Kimberly and Cassidy are from Saskatoon, and I had the pleasure of visiting with both of them in my office today, as I did last summer, Mr. Speaker. Cassidy was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis when she was 5. Right after that diagnosis, she began raising money for cystic fibrosis research, Mr. Speaker, as we so often see in the province of Saskatchewan. She started a business with the help of her parents, Mr. Speaker, that we are all familiar with, and it's named Cassidy's Lemonade Stand, and it's been a tremendous success, raising some $40,000 plus for CF research to date, Mr. Speaker. In addition to some help from her parents, she receives a lot of help from her 7-year-old sister, Lucia, Mr. Speaker. She makes her lemonade out of freshly squeezed lemons, fresh water, and a secret ingredient that she cannot disclose, not to anyone, likely not even her mother. Mr. Speaker, Cassidy's Lemonade is now sold across Saskatoon from an ice cream truck that the family bought on Kijiji, and I understand it's going to be coming to Regina next spring and summer, and we look forward to that, Cassidy. It was very inspiring, Mr. Speaker, with the conversations that I have had with Janae, with Kimberly, and with Cassidy today, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to more of just those conversations, and I want to thank them. I want to thank them for the example that they have provided to each of us in this Assembly and people across the province, Mr. Speaker, and I want to ask all members to welcome them to their Assembly here today.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, leave for an extended introduction.
Members ask for extended introduction. Leave granted. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Very much. I'd like to join the Premier in welcoming the folks from Cystic Fibrosis Canada today, patients who are affected, their families, and the advocates who work on their behalf. This is a condition that makes life really difficult for families, and it takes a lot of work. I really appreciate the work of Cassidy as a lemonade stand entrepreneur and of everyone who's working to make sure that we're making the resources available and continuing to work for a cure for cystic fibrosis. So thank you for that. Seated in front of them, Mr. Speaker, is Mr. Gordon Barnhart, our former Lieutenant Governor and President of SUMA. Great to see Gordon here today, and thankful for all of the work that he does on behalf of Saskatchewan's hometowns. And then in the gallery opposite, Mr. Speaker, today we have some representatives from the Labour movement here in Saskatchewan. We have Darla de Geer-Zahorski from the Canadian Labour Congress, Kent Peterson from the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour, and a special guest, Laurie Jobe. Laurie Jobe is filling some big shoes. She's recently taken over the presidency after 16 years of Mr. Hubick, and we're very excited to see her in that role, Mr. Speaker. She's got lots of enthusiasm for it. She's a healthcare worker herself, advocating for frontline workers. She's also been a tireless advocate on behalf of people who are victims of interpersonal violence. So I'd like to ask all of the members to join me in welcoming the folks from CF Canada, Mr. Barnhart, and of course the folks from SFL, including the new president, to their legislature.
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to join with the Premier in welcoming Kimberly and Cassidy and Janae to their Legislative Assembly. Mr. Speaker, Janae's son Alex is from Rosetown, as the Premier mentioned. He's a great young man. He's a big hockey fan. His loyalties are torn between Vancouver and the Winnipeg Jets, and I'm going to keep working on him hard to become a Boston Bruins fan as well, Mr. Speaker. Also joining them in the gallery, Mr. Speaker, are a number of other people from CF Canada that had met with a number of MLAs on both sides of the House, I believe, today and yesterday, Mr. Speaker. We have Joan Liddington, Pat Crutzen, Katarina Nekvatal, Andrea Pratt, Angie Mihailitz, Kelly Grover, Janice Daniels, Twyla McDougall, and Christopher McDougall. Again, there was a number, I know from comments I've heard from my colleagues, there was a number of good meetings around the building the last couple of days. I'd like to thank all the folks from CF Canada for being here, advocating, and welcome them to their Legislative Assembly. Hear, hear. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon, Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join in with the Premier, the Leader of the Opposition, and the Minister in welcoming our guests from Cystic Fibrosis Canada, who we had a chance to meet with this morning as well. It was an absolute pleasure. I want to thank you for your strong advocacy, your organization, and really having concerted asks to bring to the table. I really appreciated the opportunity, as did the Leader of the Opposition and folks on this side of the House, to engage in those discussions. We look forward to many other conversations, and just thank you for being here today, and we'll see you at the event this evening as well. So I'd ask all members to join me in welcoming these members to the Assembly.
I recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, to you and through you, I'd like to welcome to the Assembly a constituent of mine, and that's Honourable Gordon Barnhart, who is the Councillor of the town of Saltcoats, President of SUMA, and I think many just in the history of the Honourable Barnhart is he was the 20th Lieutenant Governor of this institution between 2006 and 2012. He was a clerk of the Senate of Canada. He was also the interim president of the U of S. And to many probably don't know, he's a very active sailor yet. And he's still looking for other things to do as well. So I'd certainly like everyone to welcome the Honourable Gordon Barnhart to his Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member from Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I too wish to rise in my place and welcome all the CF Canada representatives. I know that they've had many champions throughout the years, and many people have traveled many miles and have gone to countless meetings. One such champion from my constituency hails from Beauval, Saskatchewan. I want to welcome Angie Mihailitz, who has been steadfast in her support and very vigilant in her efforts. And Mr. Speaker, it is champions like Angie that are making a significant difference for those that are fighting with the CF challenge. So on that note, I'd ask all members to welcome my constituent, Angie, to her Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Leader of the Opposition in welcoming Laurie Jobe to the Legislature and congratulate her on her new role with the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour. Look forward to working with her on committees and a number of other areas where our paths will cross. I would like to also take this opportunity to thank outgoing President Larry Hubick for his many years of service. I met with him earlier in the day on some transition issues, so I look forward to those falling into place relatively well. I've done some family research, and Laurie Jobe's husband, and through marriage, is related to my great-grandfather, so I'm sure that that combined DNA will lead to great labor relations in our province. So That's something I'm going to be hanging my hat on as we go through stuff, and look forward to working with that. And I see that she's also joined some other people in the chamber as well, one of whom is Same Old Kent, which is the Twitter handle for Kent Peterson, who's up there as well. So I'd like to ask all members to join in welcoming them to the legislature today.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to join with the Minister and members opposite to join in welcome of a couple of these guests. Certainly new SFL President Laurie Job, who's been a long advocate for workers, hails from Leroy, and just thought I'd put on the record that she can really crush a golf ball as well, so maybe a little known fact. Seated in your gallery, it's an honor to join with the Minister responsible for municipal affairs to welcome his honor. I still struggle to not call him his honor, but President of SUMA, Gordon Barnhart, and to thank him for his leadership on behalf of Saskatchewan's hometowns, but to thank him for his life of leadership in this province and to this country. As clerk of this legislature, as clerk in Ottawa for the Senate, as Lieutenant Governor, as the President of the University of Saskatchewan, this is somebody who's served the people of this province in so many capacities. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize two people that have, or a few people that really left a mark on me here today, and it's an honor to welcome constituents Twyla and Chris McDougall to their assembly. It was, I'm just so thankful that we were able to take the time today and you're able to share with me the journey of Ella, their 8-year-old daughter who has cystic fibrosis. The challenges that they've worked together as a family are remarkable. This is an incredibly strong young woman, and I'm just thankful for sharing for their time with me here today. You know, that young girl for many years has been taking 3 to 4 hours of physical therapy every day at home with the family. That's an amazing commitment. I also want to recognize Pat Crutzen that's here today and recognize the life of their daughter Diane, her daughter Diane that passed away at age 51, I believe. And just thank you, Pat, for continuing to advocate and continue to fight for the medications needed and for the life deserved by those living with CF. And thank you for sharing the life of your daughter with me here today, somebody who was a business person, who was a master gardener, who was an artist, and somebody whose motto was live, laugh, and love. And I think we could all use a little more of that as well. So I welcome these individuals to their assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too want to stand and welcome the advocates from CF Canada that are here today. I specifically wanted to acknowledge Kimberly and Cassidy Evans, Mr. Speaker. They're from the great constituency of Saskatoon Northwest. So I wanted to thank them for being here, being strong advocates for cystic fibrosis and the research that needs to be done, Mr. Speaker, to deal with horrific disease, Mr. Speaker. And I know we're all looking forward to the lemonade truck when it comes to Regina next year. And Cassidy, I can tell you, can guarantee that there will be a very long lineup for your lemonade when you get here. So the Premier is going to lead the lineup for that. So, Mr. Speaker, I do want to stand and welcome Cassidy and Kimberly to their legislative assembly.
I recognize the member for Melfort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I'd like to introduce in the West Gallery the Leroy School, their grade 11 class, and their teacher here is with them today is Audrey Severson. And earlier I was telling them I was hoping to have a fairly subdued question period, and they said, oh my, we're looking for a lively question period. So that shows you the kind of quality of young men and women we're raising in this province today. So also their intern Rochelle Block is here with them this morning, or this afternoon. So I'd like to ask that we welcome them to their legislative assembly.
I also have an introduction as well. Joining us today, I'd like to introduce Ms. Sarah Wood, who's the manager of visitor experiences here at the legislature. Born in Regina, Sarah's background is in museums and heritage buildings, having worked most recently as the education and public programs coordinator for the Western Development Museum in Yorkton. Sarah holds a Bachelor of Arts Honours degree in History and Classical and Medieval Studies from the University of Regina, currently completing her Master's of Arts in History. Sarah is excited about her new role. She looks forward to continuing to offer the high-quality educational and public programming that Saskatchewan has appreciated from the Legislative Building. Please welcome Sarah to her legislature. Presenting petitions. Recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to present petitions on behalf of concerned citizens, workers across our province. They're calling to attention the fact that the Sask Party has created the second lowest minimum wage in Canada, and the fact that this is in essence a poverty wage for workers across our province. And the fact remains that no one should be working full-time and still not able to make ends meet and having to visit the food bank or take on second and third jobs, which is all too often a reality for workers across the province. Of course, this is an incredible hardship for workers and for families, but it costs our economy. It hurts our economy when families aren't able to keep their head above water, aren't able to put a dollar back in the economy and small businesses at the end of the month. And the prayer reads as follows. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to adopt a plan to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour for all workers. This petition here is signed by concerned people in Regina. I so submit.
I recognize the member for Lloydminster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, the citizens of Saskatchewan know that a carbon tax is just a tax grab by our federal government. This carbon tax would seriously hurt our economy, in particular the oil and gas, manufacturing, mining and farming sectors, while doing nothing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A Made in Saskatchewan plan, like our Prairie Resilience Plan, which focuses on innovation and technology, does much more to reduce GHG emissions while still supporting our industries, businesses and our citizens. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action to cause the Government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by citizens of Paradise Hill, Frenchman Butte and Lloydminster. I do so present.
Well done. I recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to present a petition from a number of people here today. They wish to bring to our attention the following. The permanent closure of Main Street access to Highway Number 1 in the town of Balgonie, Saskatchewan. I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan take the necessary steps and actions to leave the west in, west out driving access for vehicles in and out of Balgonie, Saskatchewan at the intersection of Highway 1 and Main Street, Balgonie, Saskatchewan. We also respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan put up a locked gate on the apron between the eastbound lanes and westbound lanes of Highway Number 1 and Balgonie, Saskatchewan Main Street intersection. This gate would allow emergency services access to the eastbound lanes of Highway Number 1 at Main Street, Balgonie, Saskatchewan intersection, but would not allow the public access to cross east and westbound lanes. Mr. Speaker, among the many people who have signed this petition today, we have citizens of the cities of Regina and the town of Earl Grey, Saskatchewan. I so submit.
Here. Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics. And the undersigned residents of the province of Saskatchewan want to bring to attention to this House the following, that Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions and individuals, even those living outside the province, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties. And you know, Mr. Speaker, that the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. And Mr. Speaker, over the past 10 years, the Saskatchewan Party has received $12.61 million in corporate donations. Of that, $2.87 million come from companies outside Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people.
That's right.
And we know that the federal government and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and now British Columbia have moved to limit this influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party to overhaul Saskatchewan's campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition come from the city of Regina. Thank you very much.
Hear, hear, hear.
Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I stand in my place once again to present a petition on the Orkambi. Whereas Orkambi was approved by Health Canada for use in cystic fibrosis patients with 2 copies of the F508del CFTR mutation aged 12 years and older. Whereas Orkambi is the first drug to treat the basic defect in the largest population of Canadians with cystic fibrosis. It can slow disease progression, allowing patients to live longer, healthier lives. Whereas CF specialists have established clinical criteria for Orkambi, including start and stop criteria. These specialists are best suited to manage access to medications in the treatment of CF patients. So reading the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan urge the Ministry of Health to negotiate a fair price for Orkambi and make it available through the Saskatchewan Drug Plan for those who meet the conditions set by Health Canada and the clinical criteria established by the Canadian CF clinicians. Now, Mr. Speaker, the people that have signed the many pages that we have presented in the past and continue to sign this petition are from all throughout the country and all throughout Saskatchewan. And the people that have signed this particular page are primarily from Beauval, and I so present.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in my place today to present a petition calling for pharmacare in Saskatchewan. These citizens wish to bring to our attention that Canada is the only country with a universal health care system that doesn't include prescription drug coverage, and this oversight results in unnecessary illness and suffering and costs us billions. That over 90% of Canadians agree that we need a national pharmacare program, which makes sense as 1 in 5 Canadians don't fill prescriptions because the medications cost too much. And when we cover essential medications, we improve people's quality of life and save millions in downstream costs. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Saskatchewan Party government to immediately support the establishment of universal pharmacare for Saskatchewan patients and advocate for a national pharmacare for all Canadians. This petition is signed by individuals from Kamsack and Fort Capel. I do so present.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. I recognize the member for Saskatchewan Rivers.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, November 7th, is the celebration of Diwali. Mr. Speaker, Diwali is known as a festival of lights and takes place every fall. This festival is bright, fun, full of energy, friendship, and culture. For many days, families prepare for a night of Diwali as they light up the inside and outside of their homes, offices, and cultural centers. Mr. Speaker, it's an evening full of dancing, singing, great food, and spending time with amazing people. Diwali continues to be a tremendous opportunity to show people in our community the richness of the Indian culture. It is so fitting as a festival of light signifies the victory of light over darkness, good over evil, and hope over despair, an important reminder for all of us. As we prepare to light up the night, we are reminded of Saskatchewan's strength and diversity. Diversity makes our society stronger, brings us closer together, and strengthens our community. I encourage everyone in this assembly to take part in a Diwali celebration tonight and share in the light and tradition of this beautiful festival. I, along with several of my colleagues, enjoyed last evening's celebration. I now ask that all members in this Assembly join me in wishing everyone a happy Diwali.
Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the great privileges of representing the constituency of Regina Elphinstone Centre is that you get to work with a lot of tremendous individuals and organizations that care very deeply about the well-being of community. And one such organization in that regard, Mr. Speaker, is the Indigenous Christian Fellowship, who this fall is celebrating 40 years of service to the community. The focus of ICF is supporting the health and well-being of First Nations individuals and families in Regina. The mandate of ICF is to serve the social and spiritual needs of First Nations people by building relationships with people and by helping people build relationships with the Creator. The Indigenous Christian Fellowship blends First Nations tradition and values with Christian traditions and values, resulting in an inclusive and caring spiritual framework that the ICF works very well within. In fact, Mr. Speaker, they were about reconciliation long before that became current. The ICF hosts family breakfast and a weekly lunch of soup and bannock. Every Thursday they hold a giveaway of household items, and once or twice a year they host a community chili cook-off, and they recently hosted a tremendous 40th anniversary gala. I'd like to recognize my good friend Bert Adama, who's been the guiding hand of the Indigenous Christian Fellowship for as long as I can remember. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to invite the Assembly to thank Bert, his second-in-command, Betty Cronin, and all of the volunteers at the Indigenous Christian Fellowship for 40 years of ongoing excellent service to the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Northwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last night I, along with the Premier, the Minister of Social Services, and the Leader of the Opposition, had the pleasure of attending the 64th Annual B'nai B'rith Silver Plate Dinner in Saskatoon. This annual event is Saskatoon's longest-running charitable dinner that brings together almost 1,000 guests from all walks of life. Silver Plate Dinner is known for its commitment to promoting human rights and philanthropy, all while sharing the good company of friends. Following the success of last night's fundraising event, B'nai B'rith is set to donate $70,000 to 4 local organizations dedicated to improving the lives of children, including King George School, Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Saskatoon, Saskatoon Inner City, Inc., and Some Theatre. Each year, B'nai B'rith honors the local residents with the We Are Proud of You Award, celebrating exemplary volunteerism. This year's award was presented to Bruce Rempel of Rempel Brothers Construction. Bruce has impacted many families over the last 10 years through his charitable undertakings. Among them, Bruce established the Dignity Fund at Bedford Road Collegiate and set up a Help One website to support students in over 30 schools. Bruce's company, Rempel Brothers Construction, has been giving back to the community for years, sponsoring many sports teams and donating to a wide variety of charities. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate Bruce Rempel on this prestigious award and thank B'nai B'rith Lodge for hosting another memorable evening. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to take this opportunity to recognize the important role and positive impact Saskatchewan credit unions have in our province. Saskatchewan is stronger because of our 44 credit unions' investment and support in our communities. They reinvest profits in responsible and sustainable initiatives and remain on the cutting edge of innovation and technological advances to the benefit of the nearly 500,000 credit union members in Saskatchewan. As one credit union advertises, we're focused on Scar Street, not Bay Street. We celebrate credit unions during Co-op Week in October by raising the co-op flag here at the Legislature and at the Saskatchewan Cooperative Merit Awards. I would like to take the opportunity to give a special shout out to inspiring woman leader Marianne Yerzenyuk from Affinity Credit Union, who won the Young Cooperator Award. Mr. Speaker, the current provincial government recently decided to phase out the small business tax deduction for credit unions. Credit unions are unable to benefit from the federal incentives for chartered banks, and by cutting the provincial incentive, our local member-owned financial institutions are facing a real challenge because of this government's decisions. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in celebrating the credit union sector and thank the industry leaders who generously hosted members from both sides of the House last night.
Hear, hear. I recognize the member for Saskatoon Willow Grove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This past Saturday, the Canadian 80-plus Hockey Hall of Fame celebration was held in Saskatoon. It kicked off with a challenge game between the 75-plus old-timers team and the Bantam girls hockey team from Saskatoon Minor Hockey Association. Mr. Speaker, the event was a wonderful opportunity for all ages to come together, meet former NHLers, and share in a sport that is so important to our province. This was the first time that the Canadian 80-plus Hockey Hall of Fame was held in Western Canada. A group of 30 individuals, including hockey legends and builders, inducted into this year's Hall of Fame, including Stan Halliwell, a constituent of Saskatoon Willow Grove, and Dave Brown, both 84 years young. Stan's secret to playing for so many years, Mr. Speaker, is that he claims to stay out of the corners. He says it's good advice for legislators as well. Hockey was a very different sport back when Dave and Stan began to play, but the heart and the enthusiasm they have passed on from generation to generation is still alive and well. Mr. Speaker, Stan was one of the founding members of the 60-plus league and still plays twice a week today. This weekend was such a wonderful celebration of players like Stan and Dave, and their commitment to hockey and community has shaped many generations. Mr. Speaker, I now ask that all members please join me in congratulating the inductees into the Canadian 80-plus Hockey Hall of Fame.
Recognize the member for Moose Jaw North.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the Better Together food drive was held in Moose Jaw last week on Halloween evening. This huge community event is organized by volunteers of the Hillcrest Church and nearly 500 more volunteers collecting, organizing, and packaging food donations for the local food bank. Preparing for the food drive begins many weeks in advance as Karen McNaughton and her volunteers begin to plot out pickup routes, designate food organizers and packers, as well as organizing a marketing strategy. The campaign covers the entire city for food donations for the Moose Jaw District Food Bank, so they are able to fill their shelves and prepare for the busy season of Christmas and New Year's. Citizens are asked to place their non-perishable food donations in the pre-circulated paper bag and leave it on the front door, by the front door for volunteers to pick up. Donations are taken to a central point to be organized into specific food groups, then packaged for storing. Thanks to Mother Nature for giving us a beautiful evening, allowing volunteers to go out and solicit the entire city, receiving a great response from the community and collecting 54,000 pounds of food. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in thanking Karen McNaughton and her team of dedicated volunteers and all the Moose Jaw citizen donors on the success of the Better Together food drive. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Regina Wall Shakers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On October 13th, OPA could be heard throughout the Queensbury Centre everywhere you went. Myself, along with the members from Regina Rochdale and Regina Wascana Plains, attended my big fat Greek dinner organized by our Greek community. Upon entering the building, it was as if you were transported back directly to Athens, Mr. Speaker. A delicious array of traditional Greek foods, desserts, and authentic spirits were served. The entertainment was great as well, as guests were treated with performances by Theros, a Greek band, as well as performances of traditional Greek dances from various regions throughout the country. Mr. Speaker, Regina's Greek community is a philanthropic-based community which raises funds in support of various local, national, and international charities, all while proudly showcasing their Greek culture. My Big Fat Greek Dinner, formerly called An Evening in Greece, has raised an impressive $2 million for various charities across Saskatchewan since 1994. Mr. Speaker, the funds raised from this year's successful event will be donated to Hope's Home, a charity that everyone in the community, this legislature can get behind. Mr. Speaker, the initiative of St. Paul's Greek Orthodox Church will also have funds going to that. I'd like to extend a huge thanks to the numerous sponsors of the event and to Regina's Greek community for showering all the guests with wonderful, authentic Greek hospitality and for the continued philanthropic events and achievements. Mr. Speaker, thank you. You're here.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his throne speech, the Premier recently doubled down on his refusal to look at fairer wages for Saskatchewan workers. Just last month, the minimum wage went up in Alberta by $1.40 an hour. In Saskatchewan, it went up by 10 cents, a whole dime. For a Saskatchewan full-time worker, that means about $180 more a year. For that same worker in Alberta, that's over $200 more a month. And of course, that's destroyed Alberta's economy. With a GDP growth that's way higher than us, job growth that's way higher than Saskatchewan, and an increase in restaurant sales, an industry that this government has punished by introducing PST on restaurant meals. Mr. Speaker, there's more people with money in their pockets to spend in local economies in Alberta. We could be doing the same here. But in Saskatchewan, instead, we've got people working full-time and stopping by the food bank on the way home from work because they can't afford to feed their family on the wages they're earning. Mr. Speaker, why is this Premier so down on wages going up?
I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, a number of years ago, this government was the first government to bring in a formula, Mr. Speaker, to determine the minimum wage increases here in the province of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, that was introduced in this legislative assembly, passed, Mr. Speaker, and we were the first to index our minimum wage to the wage the rate of inflation, Mr. Speaker, as well as the average wages in the province. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, is we have also taken great strides here in the province of Saskatchewan to improve the affordability of Saskatchewan residents and Saskatchewan's families, Mr. Speaker, in particular those, Mr. Speaker, in the low-income brackets here in the province. In fact, we are seeing the success of that with 112,000 people in this province, Mr. Speaker, that have been removed from the income tax rolls here in communities across Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite the Leader of the Opposition is actually mistaken, Mr. Speaker, as over the course of our term in government, we have had the second lowest, Mr. Speaker, provincial tax utility and the second highest rate of job growth here in the nation, Mr. Speaker, and those are bolstered by the results that came out, Mr. Speaker, just last week. The fact of the matter is, and this is where the member opposite will be going, Mr. Speaker, is to a $15 minimum wage that will cost jobs, Mr. Speaker, across this nation, and most notably in this province. That's been identified by numerous organizations, including the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier predictably raises concerns about jobs in Saskatchewan as he should, as we should all be looking at jobs in Saskatchewan. I have concerns as well. Where he's mistaken, where he hasn't looked at the economics of this, is the fears that he's putting out about increasing the minimum wage and its impact on jobs. Mr. Speaker, the evidence in Alberta, in Ontario, all over the world, wherever this has been tried, it's had a positive impact on employment. It's improved health outcomes, it's decreased spending on social services, and it improves local economy because people have more money in their pockets they can afford to spend at local businesses. Mr. Speaker, the Premier is mistaken. That's okay. He can learn. Will he learn is the big question. Will he do the work? Will he actually review the evidence, take a hard look at his policy, and make the right choice? Will he improve our policies here, or will he stick to his vaunted formula and keep us locked in so that once again this spring we'll have the lowest minimum wage in the country? And will he be the one telling Saskatchewan workers that Alberta workers are worth a decent wage, but they aren't?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, they weren't my words, so I don't know how I could be mistaken. They're the Bank of Canada's report, Mr. Speaker, that said a $15 per hour minimum wage increase, Mr. Speaker, would cost 60,000 jobs in the nation of Canada, Mr. Speaker. Closer to home, the CFIB, their report, Mr. Speaker, said it would potentially result in a job loss between 7,500 and 17,000 jobs in communities that we represent in this province, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, despite headwinds, Mr. Speaker, in this province, headwinds to our economy through natural resource prices, federally imposed regulations supported by the members opposite in many cases, we continue to increase the jobs that are available and being filled in this province with the year-over-year employment stats that were just released last week, Mr. Speaker, up 9,400 jobs over last year, Mr. Speaker. This is the strongest job growth in our province in 4 years, Mr. Speaker, and it adds to 63,000 jobs that have been added here in our province, Mr. Speaker, over the last decade. And we know what that recipe does, Mr. Speaker. As we increase the jobs, we increase the opportunities in our communities, Mr. Speaker, so we can continue to invest in the services, health care and education that people expect their provincial government to be investing in, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, those fears are always trucked out every time there's a discussion about minimum wage, but they're never realized when it's actually put in place. It has a positive impact on the economy. But somehow, for Conservatives and the big companies who they like to support with subsidized bus services, it's never the right time to pay workers a decent wage. Mr. Speaker, this intransigence is disappointing, but it's not surprising. We've seen this movie before. We've seen this government double down on scrapping STC, despite evidence that it was hurting farmers, hurting seniors, hurting Indigenous people, hurting students all over rural Saskatchewan, at the same time as they were subsidizing a bus service for Loblaws. Well, at the end of last month, Mr. Speaker, we saw the federal government come forward with funding for provinces that have been harmed by the closure of Greyhound. We see now LaRange is no longer having service, and there's no private company stepping up to fill in and make sure that people from LaRange have a way to visit the rest of the province. Well, Mr. Speaker, will this Premier take advantage of the federal support? Will he improve access to transport, or will he double down, leaving money on the table and leaving people stranded on the side of the road?
I recognize the Minister of Crown Investments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Greyhound services were cancelled by Greyhound for the same reason that we cancelled STC, Mr. Speaker. We wound STC down. Ridership was way down, Mr. Speaker. Now, private companies have stepped up. They've taken a lot of the routes on, and some have found it profitable, some have not. The one that the Leader of the Opposition is talking about actually couldn't get enough rides. They still will provide rides out of LaRange, but they, at a minimum of 4 people that have to travel. They were lots of times going empty, or one person on that road, Mr. Speaker, and they found that they could not survive. They couldn't pay the gas, Mr. Speaker. So, because people were finding rides with friends and with family, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, no, it is not our intention to sign on or jump on board with what the federal government has offered, Mr. Speaker. We've been down that road and we're not going again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It wasn't that long ago when the Minister of Labour rolled into the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour Convention and described his presence as that of a, quote, skunk at a garden party. But, Mr. Speaker, the real elephant in the room wasn't just the large number of expired contracts with the people who provide the services that we all count on. It was this government's long-standing disrespect for the civil service. Disrespect that was on full display with this government's demand of a 3.5% wage rollback in the 2017 budget. That 3.5% ask was never withdrawn from the teachers' bargaining, and there's still a great deal of confusion about whether the cut is on or off the table. So can the minister update the House? How many agreements with the workers of the province are currently expired and lapsed? And can he provide proof to this House that the 3.5% cut is indeed off of each and every one of those tables?
I recognize the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have the exact number of tables that are not settled right at the moment. It's the majority of the public sector bargaining tables. Depending on where they're at in their negotiations, some haven't sat for some time, haven't met for some time, so that there hasn't been anything put on the table by either side, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker. There is evidence that's been in the media that there has been offers taken to memberships that are not minus 3.5%, right, as well as there's been a settlement of 000, which is not minus 3.5%. Mr. Speaker, will respect the bargaining process. We'll allow those tables to do what they do best, Mr. Speaker, and we will not negotiate on the floor of the Assembly.
Hear, hear. Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Mr. Speaker, if that government is surprised that the people of Saskatchewan aren't quite willing to take them on faith that the cut is gone, they shouldn't be surprised. After all, the Sask Party told us with great fanfare that cutting Deputy Minister and Crown Corporation executive salaries would save hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. But the payee disclosure list tells a very different story. The men and women of Sask Power's senior management team saw their payout grow by almost 20%. And SaskTel executives saw an increase of almost 15%, Mr. Speaker. So can the finance minister or the labor minister or the public service minister or perhaps the premier tell us what the target is for the year to come for executive compensation and what steps will be taken to ensure that they don't miss the target so very badly?
I recognize the Minister of Crown Investments.
Well, I guess, Mr. Speaker, they're not stuck with one of those. They're stuck with the Minister for Crown Investments. Mr. Speaker, we appreciate the very hard work of all the employees at our Crowns, Mr. Speaker, and our Crown executives, Mr. Speaker. Deputy Minister and Crown CEOs did participate in a 3.5% pay rollback, Mr. Speaker, to their base salaries. Mr. Speaker, the disclosure report included all aspects of compensation, including salary, vacation, etc. Mr. Speaker, Crown executives don't get paid overtime; they get their regular pay. I recently met with the board chairs, Mr. Speaker, as well, and stressed to them the importance of maintaining strong public utilities, Mr. Speaker, while keeping executive compensation in line. So we expect that to continue on in this year and the following year, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Mr. Speaker, this is a government that promised to be the most transparent, most accountable government ever, Mr. Speaker. But it hasn't really worked out that way. So I guess in terms of public accounts and payee disclosure lists, they're useful, but I guess it's well past time that this government get with the 21st century and perhaps provide a searchable online resource, one that would allow the people of Saskatchewan to see clearly how the government is spending their numbers, so that they'll know in relatively short order, Mr. Speaker, when the minister is talking about numbers that just don't add up. Will they commit to providing that resource for the people today?
Hear, hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Crown Investments.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member opposite for the question. Mr. Speaker, those numbers come out, Mr. Speaker, and they're the same as they've been for years under the members opposite, Mr. Speaker. They can go look at them, and they can see them. It is a public disclosure that anybody can look at, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we intend to keep a close eye on executive compensation and through the Crowns and through government, and we will continue, Mr. Speaker. But you know, Mr. Speaker, that's not what's going to not help the Crowns, and that, Mr. Speaker, is, of course, a carbon tax that's fully supported by the members opposite, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, we live in the only country that has universal health coverage that doesn't include prescription drugs. This lack of coverage costs Canadians billions of dollars a year. Mr. Speaker, joining us today is Helen Campbell, a nurse and healthcare provider for 46 years. She has witnessed firsthand the impact of expensive drug costs on patients. She's told me about seeing friends forced to choose between paying for groceries and paying for medication, or having to cancel programs that keep them healthy so that they're able to afford increasing drug costs. Helen knows the people of Saskatchewan shouldn't have to choose between their health and their bank balance. Our healthcare system can't fully deliver without universal pharmacare. What does the minister have to say to healthcare providers like Helen who see the costs of not taking action on pharmacare each and every day?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. As we've discussed in this Assembly before, it has been well documented, Mr. Speaker, on pharmacare. Our government is cooperating fully with the federal government, with Dr. Eric Hoskins, who's heading up the review. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Rural and Remote Health and myself have had an opportunity to meet with them. We look forward to that opportunity again. We look forward to his findings, Mr. Speaker. Somehow the opposition seems to think that we're opposed to this or something. We're not, Mr. Speaker. We are cooperating fully. We look forward to the results. We want to see what the proposal is they come back with, but we're not going to just sign on to a blanket endorsement of something we've never seen, Mr. Speaker. We want to see what the details look like. We want to see what the cost of the pharmacare program would be. We want to make sure that we don't take a step back in coverage, Mr. Speaker, because while we certainly can always do better, we need to remember in Saskatchewan we have coverage for children, we have coverage for seniors. Mr. Speaker, for low-income people, we have, frankly, the most robust coverage in the country, Mr. Speaker. We hope we can take a step forward, but we're going to ensure for the people of the province that we don't take a step back.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. I recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, this is another example of the minister not following the evidence. Even though physicians, experts, and nurses like Helen have established consensus on pharmacare, all levels of government have sat on their hands. It's a missed opportunity, Mr. Speaker. A national pharmacare plan could save Saskatchewan $320 million a year. These savings could be redirected to create more long-term care beds, improve staffing, and strengthen home care supports. We know what the answers are, and that will actually save money by participating. To the minister, if the federal government fails to step up, what is the minister's plan to establish a fully funded national pharmacare program in Saskatchewan?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, just because the question is written doesn't mean the member has to read it, Mr. Speaker. I explained that in the first answer. We are fully cooperating. We are hopeful of the results of this review, Mr. Speaker. And if it's good, if it's a step forward for our citizens, if the federal government will be a full funding partner and it's an improvement, Mr. Speaker, absolutely we would endorse. But, Mr. Speaker, we have to see what it is first. The federal government isn't even calling on us to completely endorse a blanket coverage that no one has even seen, Mr. Speaker. They're doing the legwork. These questions, frankly, Mr. Speaker, would be better put to the federal health minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister of Highways said time doesn't matter when it comes to safety. Well, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to emergencies, time is actually everything. Ministry officials knew this, which is why they were so frustrated with the response from the P3 company from France. It is only because the community fought for a temporary barricade instead of a permanent barricade that these trucks could leave town when they had to reroute into Balgony. A resident wrote the minister, and I quote, "Do you have any idea how dangerous this was? If it had been permanently blocked, where would they go? Right in front of our two schools. Brilliant. Oh, but it's not your children affected, is it?" End quote. Now, Mr. Speaker, this was a very scary situation, one that should have never have happened in the first place. How did the Sask Party get it so wrong?
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. And I think he's kind of misquoting what I meant to say. Time is very important when it comes to safety, and sometimes it may take a little bit longer to get it right, but safety is very important. Mr. Speaker, this was an unfortunate event that took place, and the response time was longer than is acceptable. I assure you that this was addressed with RBDB, and something like this should not happen again. Through this incident, a deficiency was found, and because of the way our P3 projects are set up, it was fixed at no cost to the taxpayer. Mr. Speaker, it is also worth noting that about 830 trucks use Highway 46 at Balgony every day, meaning tens of thousands of trucks have used those roundabouts without incident, and it's been open since it's been open to traffic. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon, Newtana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister likes to talk about safety, but it took almost a full year for this safety concern to be fixed because this government and the P3 conglomerate were too busy squabbling about who was going to pay. Wow. And contrary to the minister's assertions, it wasn't without costs. Bureaucrats were consumed for months handling this issue on behalf of the consortium. They can read the FOI, Mr. Speaker. In correspondence on the issue, officials described the public who are expressing concern with the roundabout design as, quote, entitled. Does the minister agree that residents in this province wanting to be safe in their communities and do something straightforward like safely enter and leave their communities are entitled?
Hear, hear. Hear. I recognize the Minister of Highways.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and once again I thank the member opposite for the question. But, you know, with respect, I'd like to address these types of incidents that we're not actually reporting these days. In 2013, there were over 120 collisions on Highway 21 from Regina to Balgony. Last year, data we received from SGI shows that there were 29 collisions. And Mr. Speaker, this is a 75% reduction. And Mr. Speaker, in the words of the White City Fire Chief, before construction, I couldn't tell you how many accident scenes we were at that we were using the jaws of life. And now, I can't tell you the last time we've used them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, while I'm really appreciative that the minister knows how to read from her notes, she didn't answer the question, so I'll try it again. Does the minister agree that residents in this province wanting...
Recognize the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the minister agree with her officials that people who are simply wanting to be safe in their own communities should be labelled as entitled?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not really sure where that's coming from. But Mr. Speaker, this is all about safety. I've quoted the White City Fire Chief talking about how many incidents he's been to with the jaws of life, and he can't remember the last time he's been to them. I talked about the number of accidents that have been on this roadway. I respect the fact that there are a lot less accidents now and the fact that it's this project that has brought that safety to our roadways. That's right. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll make no apologies, and I respect every single person in that community, and that's why safety is top of mind for this government.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
If it was safety, Mr. Speaker, why did it take a year for it to get fixed? That's the first question. But still, back to the original question. Does the minister agree with her officials who have labelled people as entitled who are simply concerned about safety? They're concerned about safety in their own community.
Hear, hear.
I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, these are interesting questions coming from the members opposite after this record investment, the largest investment in any infrastructure project in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, an infrastructure project focused on the safety of the residents of this province, Mr. Speaker. An infrastructure project focused on ensuring that trucks can get around our capital city on our national highway system, Mr. Speaker, and access the highway to our largest centre in this province, Mr. Speaker. And an infrastructure investment focused on ensuring that families in and around this city can get into the city safely, Mr. Speaker, and the statistics speak for themselves, Mr. Speaker. So most certainly, the people of this province are finished waiting because there's a government in this province that is investing on behalf of them and their families, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we're talking about the largest overrun in the history of this province. The budget that started out at $400 million, now $2 billion, far beyond what it needed to be, and it was far beyond what it needed to be to support their failing GTH project. We're fine with a bypass at Balgony. We're fine with improving safety on the east side of the province, but we hope you'll do it right. We hope that when residents raise concerns, they won't be dismissed as entitled and told that their concerns don't matter. Mr. Speaker, if we're going to have this project actually serve the people of the province, we need to see more than just a conglomerate saying we'll fix it someday. We want to see this government step up and show they have responsibility.
I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, those concerns most certainly are not dismissed, Mr. Speaker, because we made the investment and we built the highway, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, across the way we have the self-proclaimed government in waiting, Mr. Speaker, and I say again, Mr. Speaker, it was the Saskatchewan people that were waiting when they had the opportunity to serve on behalf of the people as a government of this province, Mr. Speaker. It was the people that were waiting for them to fix their highways. It was the people that were waiting for them to invest in a children's hospital in this province, Mr. Speaker. It was the people of this province that were waiting for them to invest in schools and communities that I live in, Mr. Speaker, and others live in. And Mr. Speaker, thank goodness, Mr. Speaker, the NDP are going to be waiting a long time before they're on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker.
Somebody needs to cut off the coffee. All right. Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, the Honourable Mr. Morgan.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 142, the Proceedings Against the Crown Act 2018, be now introduced and read a first time.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 142 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize the Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
To the Honourable Mr. Morgan.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 143 be now introduced and read a first time, the Proceedings Against the Crown Consequential Amendments Act 2018.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 143 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time?
Next sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
Item number 3, the Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize the Minister.
Speaker, I move that Bill number 144, the Real Estate Amendment Act 2018, be now introduced and read a first time.
Moved by the Minister that Bill number 144 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time?
Next sitting of the Assembly, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
Item number 4, the Honourable Mr. Merriman.
I recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 145, the Residential Services Act 2018, be now introduced and read the first time.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 145 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time?
Next sitting.
Next sitting. No helping.
Item number 5, the Honourable Mr. Ryder.
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 146, the Vital Statistics Amendment Act 2018, be now introduced and read a first time.
Moved by the Minister that Bill number 146 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time?
Next sitting of the Assembly.
Next sitting. Whoa. Presenting reports by standing and special committee. Orders of the day.
Written questions. Question number 4 asked by Ms. Saar.
I recognize the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answers to questions 4 through 6.
Ordered 4 through 6.
Government orders. Item number 5, Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 132, the Management and Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Rankler.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon, Newtana.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, it's my honor to enter the debate on this bill. I was wrong yesterday. I thought it was 7 years ago yesterday that I first became elected, but it was actually 7 years ago today, along with yourself and the whole class of 11, Mr. Speaker. So it's hard to believe 7 years have gone by, and it's interesting to get up on a bill that was actually originally introduced 2 years before we were elected. So it's interesting that there is a very long history to this bill, and I'm pleased to be able to have an opportunity today to go through some of that legislative history. So I think that's maybe where I'll start, and I may need to jump around a little bit, but first of all, we'll start talking about this bill as it was introduced in 2009. Back in the day, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's almost 9 years ago, or over 9 years ago, that the bill was first introduced, and I'm just going to look at some of the Hansard. That was, April 22nd, 2008, I think, was around the time that the bill was first introduced, and then fast forward to December 2nd, 2009, the bill had been already transformed into a second bill, 126, but it started off as Bill 95, and I won't go through every clause, but I do want to sort of outline the shape of the bill then as opposed to the shape of the bill now, because I think it's important for people researching this bill to understand that it had a very definite transformation, or if you're Calvin and Hobbes, transmogrification, because it's very different now, Mr. Speaker, very, very different than it was back in 2009. The original bill, the name is still pretty much the same. They've taken out some of it. Was called an Act Respecting the Management and Reduction of Greenhouse Gases and Adaptation to Climate Change. And there was a number of parts to that bill. Going through it, Part 1 was preliminary matters. Part 2 was emission baseline, emission targets, monitoring and reporting. Part 3 was the responsibilities and powers of the minister. Part 4 was the advisory council. Part 5 was something the government talked about and was very proud to announce, the Office of Climate Change. Part 6 was the part related to regulated emitters and greenhouse gas emission reduction programs. So in there was a number of divisions, Division 1 and Division 2. Division 1 related to the regulated emitters, and Division 2 was the greenhouse gas emission reduction programs and other programs. Part 7, which is basically gone now, Mr. Speaker, was a part called Special Nonprofit Corporations. So in Division 1, there was a fund set up for those nonprofit corporations. Division 2 was the Saskatchewan Climate Research and Development Corporation, and Division 3 was the Saskatchewan Climate Change Foundation. Division 4 was the Environment Corporation, and Division 5 was General Matters re these special nonprofit corporations. And then we have Part 8, which was related to administration, inspections, and enforcement. Part 9, offensive and administrative penalties, and Part 10 was the general clauses that are often included in many pieces of legislation. So if you look at the definitions that were originally in the first act, there were things like carbon compliance payment, carbon compliance price, CO2E, which is common throughout all of these bills, Mr. Speaker, and just so people understand, CO2E means the mass of carbon dioxide that would produce the same global warming potential as a given mass of another greenhouse gas determined in the prescribed manner. And it's a complicated science, Mr. Speaker, and I'm trying to sort out whether emissions intensity is tied into this or not, and I will speak about emissions intensity in a little while. But this is a mass figure. CO2E is used throughout, and it relates to a mass of carbon dioxide that would produce the same global warming potential as a given mass of another greenhouse gas determined in the prescribed manner. Now, you'll note that in the Prairie Resilience forms that are schedules, or I'll get to those as well later, but they often talk about a number of significant greenhouse gas gases. It's not just carbon dioxide. And Mr. Speaker, as you know, there's a number of serious gases that are contributing to climate change and ergo global warming. So we'll get into a discussion on that a little bit later. A number of these corporations were defined in the original act, and of course now that they're gone, they're no longer defined. A greenhouse gas is more than carbon dioxide. It's included in the definition also methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons or HFCs, perfluorocarbons, PFCs, sulfur hexafluoride, which is SF6, or any other prescribed gas. And so that's a definition that I believe has been continued in the most recent iteration of this bill. I'm just checking right now, and I can say, yeah, it's still there. The other clauses that are of interest is the greenhouse gas emission baseline, and I'm going to be talking about this quite a bit, Mr. Speaker, because this baseline has been something of a moving target for this government, and certainly prior to coming into government, it has changed significantly. So we'll be reflecting on that a little bit for sure this afternoon. The definition of offset that was originally in the original bill is gone altogether now. Also an idea of pre-certified investments, which is now no longer part of the definitions. And qualified person, I believe, is still there. And again, that's something that's very, very relevant to the current Prairie Resilience Plan when it comes to calculating emissions for the heavy emitters. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about who those qualified persons will be and how they'll be chosen. And I think this is incredibly relevant obviously to the Ministry of the Environment, but also to those heavy emitters who will be measured against different standards or standards specific to their industry. So qualified person definition has changed again because originally it was I'm going to go back to that. A member of a class of persons set out in the code, or an individual or class of individuals determined by the minister pursuant to Clause 7(2)(n). Now we see that it is where we are, qualified person, a member of a class of persons that is prescribed or set out in the code. So again, one of the problems that we saw with the original draft of this bill was the ambivalency and sort of the lack of definite targets, Mr. Speaker. So again, here we see not only the code itself not being prescribed in the original bill, which I'll speak to in a bit, but also in the new definition, it's even more vague. It's either in the code or it might be prescribed. So we don't know exactly where the definition of qualified person is coming from because I think quite simply the government hasn't decided yet. They want to get this bill through, but they haven't decided yet who that qualified person should be. And I know there was a lot of discussion when Myers Norris Penny did their outreach with the heavy emitters earlier this year. So it really, I think, leaves a lot of uncertainty and vagueness in this particular definition for qualified person. But again, I will speak about that later. One of the clauses that's gone from the first definition clause is the recognition for early action. And what was contemplated at the time, Mr. Speaker, was a certificate that specifying the amount of tons of CO2e provided to a regulated emitter to recognize actions taken before the coming in force of this act. And Mr. Speaker, as the years go by, this is going to get more and more complicated because there are many large emitters in the province of Saskatchewan, many people in the province of Saskatchewan who have already taken steps to reduce their emissions or their emissions intensity. And that work has been done voluntarily, and many people refer to it as the whole low-hanging fruit. So they may have changed all their light bulbs to be LED bulbs rather than the light bulbs that took a lot more energy. So if they've already done that, why would they not be given credit for that? And I know it's really a complicated process that needs a lot of work, and it's clearly been identified by officials. It's clearly been identified by the industries that are affected by this bill. But Obviously, it hasn't been figured out yet. So when you have a bill that has that uncertainty built into it, and they've actually removed the recognition for early action description, although I think in many ways it's being replaced by a new definition for offset credits and performance credits. So that's something that shows up in the new bill that wasn't in the old bill. And of course, there's a couple other corporations that are no longer referred to at all in the most recent iteration of this bill, the 2018 Bill number 132. As much as possible, I would like to refer to the changes throughout the 4 iterations of this Act, but it's a little too complicated, I think, to set it out clearly, Mr. Speaker. But I think if we look at the 2009 version and go to the 2018 version 2, because there's been 2 parts of this introduced, I guess 2017 it was proclaimed in force, the 3rd version, but we're looking at the 4th version now, which was the bill that was just introduced recently. So as much as possible, I'll try to walk through the transformation of this bill, but I won't be able to touch on every aspect of it. It's just a little too complicated. Part 3 is a discussion of the responsibilities of the minister. And again, I think you will find that the minister has a lot of discretion in this bill, and certainly colleagues prior to me back in 2010 were concerned about the scope of the minister's responsibilities and powers. I noticed that in the new version, a number of the original powers and responsibilities are gone. Some are amended and some are added, Mr. Speaker, and so it's again a bit complicated to go through, but I think the first part of the section is probably the most important part, 7 sub 1, and this is in both, I believe, the old bill and the new bill, and that is the minister is responsible for all matters not by law assigned to any other minister or government agency respecting greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, and adaptation to climate change. Well, Mr. Speaker, right off the hop, we know that this completely eliminates any of the oil and gas industry, which is regulated by the Minister of Energy and Resources, and it also eliminates South Power and Transgas. So when you look at the amount of greenhouse gas emissions or the percentage of emissions that are being emitted in Saskatchewan right now, this represents about 10% of the total emissions in Saskatchewan. I think we're up around 73 megatons per year of greenhouse gas emissions. So at 10%, this bill is only dealing with, well, 1/10 of the emissions in Saskatchewan. So it's been a lot of work to get here, and I worry that we're focusing solely on 10% of this time without seeing action on the other, well, at least 30 or 40% in the transportation and residential and agricultural areas as well, Mr. Speaker. Despite what's talked about in prairie resilience, this bill is actually one very small piece of the entire plan that we need to see under prairie resilience to ensure that our regulations, our emissions are reduced to a level that will support life on this planet as we know it. So we know it's a start, and I guess that's all we can ask for. It took 10 years to get here from 2009's version, but it is a start. Some of the things that are gone is in relation to the definitions that are gone, like pre-certified investments and qualified persons. So those are changed because of the definitions changing. One of the clauses that's gone is entering in agreements for on behalf of the Government of Saskatchewan with the Government of Canada. Now, I believe that's just been moved to a different part of the Act, Section 8. So it's taken out of the minister's duties and moved to the new Section 8. Now, it's only, in this case now, it's not just the minister. The minister has to get the approval of Lieutenant Governor and Council. So originally, the minister was able to enter into these agreements as the minister in his or her own right, but now the minister has to go to Lieutenant Governor and Council and obviously get cabinet approval before entering into any of these agreements. And as you know, Mr. Speaker, this has been a very highly politicized area, so I guess that's something that Cabinet wants to make sure they have control over. I don't know if back in 2009, when the equivalency agreement in principle was signed with the then Minister of Environment, that perhaps that hadn't been cleared through Cabinet, because I know we've been through a number of environment ministers since then, and they aren't referring to that equivalency agreement. So it makes you wonder what actually happened back in 2009. There's a number of other removals from that first part. The Part 4 Advisory Council, I just want to refer to both the old and new version of that. And unfortunately, Part 4, Part 5 from the old Act are completely gone, Mr. Speaker. If you look at the new bill, you'll see that there is absolutely nothing in relation to the Advisory Council at all, and well, it's repealed in its entirety, as is Part 5, the Office of the Climate Change. And Mr. Speaker, I will be referring to some of the comments in this House about how great this Office of Climate Change was going to be, and that wasn't from this side, Mr. Speaker. It was from the government side. So again, I think we'd have a lot of questions in terms of why were they backing down on that? Why did they change their mind and get rid of that office? Because as we know, those types of offices can do really great work for an issue that is kind of important, Mr. Speaker. It's important to the people of Saskatchewan, and I think it's important certainly for my son and his son and their cohort. And so having an Office of Climate Change outside of government to provide that critical eye and the critical supports for moving forward into this brave new world that we're facing, it's unfortunate at the least, and I think certainly some of the questions we'll have in committee relate to why the government has gone back in its commitment to provide an Office of Climate Change. There was also, this Part 4 was this Advisory Council, the Climate Change Advisory Council, and there were a number of questions raised about that at the time that the first version of the bill was introduced back in 2009, and concerns about who would be put on the Advisory Council, how the government would make those decisions, because as you know, Mr. Speaker, those who is on the committee will drive the direction of any committee, and certainly who would be appointed to this council. This would be an appointment by Lieutenant Governor and Council, and it would include the Minister and 11 other members. So the role of this Advisory Council wasn't really outlined a whole lot, but in Section 9, Sub 9 of the 2009 bill, it says this: the Council shall advise the Minister on matters relating to greenhouse gas emissions, climate change and adaptation to climate change, best management practices to address climate change and adaptation to climate change, and any other matter determined by the Minister. Now, I'm not sure of the entire organizational structure of the ministry. I know that there is a climate change unit currently in the ministry, and again, its makeup has changed quite significantly over the last few years, from environmental scientists to economists. I think the number crunching has become a very, very important part of climate change management. And so the data and the emissions data have become very, very important. So I'm not sure what the Minister will say if the decision to get rid of the Advisory Council and the Office of the Climate Change, if he believes that's been subsumed by the work that's being done within the ministry. But I think there was hope within both industry and NGOs and people that are working on the environment that this Advisory Council would truly reflect the people of Saskatchewan's wishes and provide that actual advice to the Minister under the Advisory Council. And the Office of Climate Change as well is something I think that would have had a lot of work that would have been very valuable. And if I'm looking at Section 14, well, actually even Section 13 of the 2009 Act, talks about the purposes of the Climate Change Office, and it was to prepare, coordinate, and implement the Saskatchewan initiatives. And that's a defined term. Mr. Speaker, and I'll just go back and describe it. It would be Saskatchewan initiatives, where initiatives, targets, plans, proceedings, and goals for Saskatchewan that relate to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and are prescribed or otherwise established by the Minister, the Lieutenant Governor, and Council. So this was the prairie resilience of the day, Mr. Speaker, and didn't get too far off the ground, but the Office of the Climate Change was supposed to be there to prepare, coordinate, and implement those initiatives. It was also to promote the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in Saskatchewan, and finally assist Saskatchewan residents and Saskatchewan's economy to adapt to climate change and to address the impacts of climate change. And Mr. Speaker, I think everyone would agree that the residents of Saskatchewan need that assistance. I think they need to be helped with their understandings of their own greenhouse gas emissions, how it applies to our transportation needs, how it applies to our residential housing needs. And I get calls all the time saying, how can I do something? How can I make a change? And this is from my niece who works for Suncor at Fort McMurray, Mr. Speaker. She's concerned about her children's future and wants to be able to be part of the change. And it's really hard sometimes to give people any hope when we see that there aren't even initiatives after 10 years now from this government to deal with residential or transportation. They're referred to as non-regulated emitters, Mr. Speaker. And the only reason they're not regulated is because they're not regulated. This government has the power to do that. This government has the power to either introduce codes or regulations or guidelines or programs, or, I mean, the list is endless in terms of what can be done, but unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, for this government, the list is pretty short. I understand the work with heavy emitters takes a lot of work. The work with the upstream oil and gas in relation to what they call it, associated gases being released into the atmosphere. That's important work. It's ongoing. We're not there yet, but at least it's ongoing. And also the work that SaskPower is doing. I think SaskPower has been a real leader in this. Again, you know, I would have liked to have seen more action sooner, but that's from the opposition's perspective, obviously. But the targets, I think, are pretty clear, and I think the way to get there is becoming more and more clear. We're not there yet, but we certainly know that what the target is, and it's up to 50% by 2030. So the benchmark seems to have moved now. 2030 is the word that's being used a lot. 10 years ago it was 2020. So unfortunately the benchmark seems to get pushed forward, but I think we have a little more clarity now in terms of what SaskPower's renewable energy targets are, and I think that those are certainly welcome, Mr. Speaker. But if we go back to the office itself, there's a number of activities that the office could have undertaken until it was abolished in this bill. So the number of things the minister could tell them to do, and I'm just going to read a few of them. There's probably 12. The minister, this is section 14A, guide, promote, coordinate, and implement policies, strategies, and programs respecting greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, and adaptation to climate change. B, undertake planning, research, and investigations, make forecasts respecting greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, and adaptation to climate change. C, install, operate, or maintain or cause to be installed, operated, or maintain devices to measure greenhouse gases. D, obtain and collect data respecting greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, and adaptation to climate change. Skipping down a little bit, G, maintain records of greenhouse gas emissions. H, recommend targets for reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. And my colleague from Saskatoon Centre was the environment critic when the prairie resilience targets were released, Mr. Speaker, when we convened in the House this spring. And what targets were they? Most of the targets that were defined, I think, were TBD. Right. Those were the targets, Mr. Speaker, TBD. To be determined. Well, if this Office of Climate Change had been established in 2009, we might have had some targets by 2018, Mr. Speaker. So it's concerning that this hasn't happened and that we're still TBD on so many of these important goals. This office would have established and maintained registries of offsets And that's a clear feature of the Prairie Resilience Plan that's being introduced right now. So again, we could have had these registries established and maintained already at this date. And there's a number of other things in here that this office would have done. So it's really concerning and unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, that that portion of the bill was never proclaimed in force, and when the bill finally gets proclaimed in force, it was still not proclaimed in force, and then in 2018 it just gets wiped out completely. So it's an unfortunate shift, and certainly I think we'll want to find out at least the thinking behind getting rid of it. Now, what's being substituted for all these different nonprofits that were established in part, I think it was part 7 of the original bill. We have a new part 7, special nonprofit corporations. Well, that's gone, Mr. Speaker. It's been eliminated, but we have a new part 6.1, and this is now called the Saskatchewan Technology Fund. So this is the new shiny version of what was originally contemplated in 2009. And in many ways, I think this is a fund that makes a lot of sense, Mr. Speaker. I think a technology fund that is separate and apart from the GRF, which was clearly the wish of the heavy emitters when they were consulted earlier this year, that is one that will help those heavy emitters take action and get credit for it, and then be able to use that money to further their reductions efforts, Mr. Speaker. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that technology fund later in context of the Myers-Norris Penny consultations that happened earlier this year with heavy emitters. So the new fund will, I think it's a little too broad right now for the liking of the heavy emitters that are being identified in this act, but I think there's room under the many regulatory rights that are regulatory powers that are being consented to under this bill, that the government may be able to cater a little bit more to the needs of those heavy emitters and how these monies will be used. And maybe it's already captured at this point in time. We certainly haven't seen the heavy emitters' response to this bill, and I think that's why we need to take some time with this bill, Mr. Speaker. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts, and it's important to ensure that not only are the needs of the people of Saskatchewan met, but the needs of the heavy emitters are being met too, and that we're not going to damage them in a rush to get this bill through in a hurry. So it's concerning, Mr. Speaker, if we have to rush this through. Different things that are established under this tech fund. There's the new section 23.1 sub 1 is referring to the name of the fund. Sub 2 is the minister's use of the fund, and subsection 4 allows the minister to delegate the administration of all or any portion of this part to another person. So obviously the minister could delegate the administration of the fund to a third party outside of the GRF and the Minister of Finance. And it goes on to describe how that will work fiscal year end. In 23.2 sub 1, we now have something called the Advisory Committee. And this is, again, approved by Lieutenant Governor and Council. And the committee has to meet on the request of the minister to advise the emitters. So we see the vestiges of the old advisory committee being now subsumed into this technology fund. They'll act on an advisory committee, and of course there's room for remuneration for their time. We don't know who's going to be on this committee. We don't know what sort of advice they're going to be asked for. That's gone from the Act. But we do know that there will be an advisory committee, and again, we don't know the size of it. It's quite vague on that, Mr. Speaker. The next section, 23.3, is one that I believe that the heavy emitters really insisted on in the consultations, and it says that this money, any money that comes into the technology fund, will be deposited in the technology fund and not in the general revenue fund. And so I think there's a number of things that can go into the fund, including money appropriated by legislature. So some of the questions that arose out of the consultations this spring, Mr. Speaker, was because SaskPower and TransGas are no longer part of this heavy emitter portion of the bill, they're being regulated in other ways, and the upstream oil and gas community as well, except for, I think it's on-site combustion. At any rate, we're not sure how much money is actually going to flow into this fund. Back in the day, in 2009, SaskPower would have also paid into the fund, as would have TransGas and upstream oil and gas. Those are some of the most significant GHG emitters in the province. And so when you take the ability, I think you're almost emasculating the fund. It's been identified that many of the heavy emitters have already come very close to their capacity in terms of reducing emissions. They've already taken steps. So it's not clear to anyone right now what, if any, monies will be flowed into the fund through the performance credits and the offsets and the different things that are being factored into this bill. So we'll see. I guess we're just going to have to see. We certainly don't have any guesses at this point if there is any money that will flow into the technology fund. But I find it interesting to note that there could be appropriations of monies into this fund. And I'm going to come back to that again, Mr. Speaker, when I talk a little bit about the old Go Green Fund that was in existence here a few years ago, and how quickly it disappeared, and the appropriations for that Go Green Fund also disappeared and dried up. So it's interesting that the legislature would be willing to appropriate monies for this technology fund and yet not have an equivalent type of appropriation for initiatives under something like the Go Green Fund or the Office of Climate Change. And there's another one under section 23.3 sub E, which says that this can also be deposited in the tech fund, and it reads as this: any other monies collected by the Government of Saskatchewan that are related to limiting, mitigating, reducing, or managing greenhouse gases, and that the regulations, another act, or the regulations made pursuant to another act direct are to be deposited in the technology fund. So there's provisions for other monies to come in, and who knows, maybe that will be from the Minister of Energy and Resources under regulations if there are funds flowing in terms of mitigating associated gases such as methane and butane coming out of the upstream oil and gas sector, Mr. Speaker. So we don't know what it's going to look like. And I guess we'll just have to wait and see, which is kind of hard to do. In section 61, the old act, I remember what happened here. Back in, I think it was 2012, the act was amended, even though it hadn't been proclaimed in force. And I was always going to ask the law clerk if you can actually amend an act that had not been proclaimed in force. But I keep forgetting about it. He's nodding yes. So obviously it's a precedent. It just seemed kind of strange that you would amend something that had never been enacted. But I guess it was enacted, but it wasn't enforced. So these are the kinds of machinations that we have to put ourselves through when we have a bill that goes through so many iterations, Mr. Speaker. But back in 2012, I believe, when the Environment Minister at that time, I believe, was the current Minister of Central Services, the Minister for Saskatoon-Willowgrove, and he had to introduce some changes because the Saskatchewan government was trying really hard to work closely with the federal government back in 2012, and they actually really wanted to continue with agreements in principle in particular, but equivalency agreements were the talk of the day, Mr. Speaker. And this government was very, very happy to work with the federal government to ensure that we negotiated equivalency agreements, that there was a compatibility between the federal government's actions on climate change and the provincial government's actions on climate change. And somehow, Mr. Speaker, that all changed in 2016. The tone changed coming from this government. And that's when we see the current Premier, who was then the Minister of Environment, actually walk out of a meeting on climate change back in 2016 after a new government came in. So it's just kind of funny when you start drawing the lines between the timelines here. The enthusiasm that this government used to show for Prime Minister Harper's climate change initiatives and Jim Prentice, when Jim Prentice was the Minister of the Environment, it just kind of dried up, Mr. Speaker, and it's a little bit unfortunate for sure. Seeing our minister walk out of a meeting like that was upsetting for many, I think, in the province. So the technology fund investments, oh yes, public information, that was back in 2012. I got distracted a little bit, Mr. Speaker, and I'm back on track. I'm on track to make this speech. Back in 2012, the then minister brought in some changes so that the bill would be in compliance with some federal regulations that were being brought down. And I think if you recall, Mr. Speaker, that's about the time we saw the coal-fired regulations come in from the federal government, requiring the phase out of combustion coal by 2030 with different requirements tied up to that. And so this government was very anxious to be sure they were compatible with the federal government's regulations. But one of the problems they had was that our bill, as it stood at the time, although not yet enforced, was proclaimed, or no, not yet proclaimed. Anyways, they had to bring in some clauses dealing with public information. So in the newer version of the bill, it was Bill 61, and I'm just going to pull that up, Mr. Speaker. It was allowing people to bring complaints individually to the legislature. I guess this version of the section was Section 60, and then in the part that was proclaimed in 2017, in December, it became Section 61, and it's continuing on as Section 61 in the new bill, although they have absolutely repealed it, and then now they've made some changes to it and reintroduced it. It's really actually a lot longer now, and I think provides a lot more detail, which is welcome, Mr. Speaker. Rather than punt this over to the regulatory world, we actually have some clarity and details in the new section in terms of what happens when public information is provided to the minister. So I think, you know, in many ways that probably is in compliance with the current Part 2 of the Federal Climate Change Bill. And I guess that's something else I want to make clear, Mr. Speaker, is that the Federal Climate Change Bill is in two parts. Part 1 is a price on carbon, and we know how this government feels about that. But Part 2 is the heavy emitter piece that was brought down in the federal laws. And if I understand correctly, this bill will actually meet the requirements of the federal bill for heavy emitters. And so what the goal of the ministry at this point in time with the introduction of this version of the bill is that they feel that they will meet the requirements of the federal government, and the federal government will stand down their version of the heavy emitter regulation, Mr. Speaker. And I think this actually really complies with something we've been calling on this government to do, is design a Made in Saskatchewan version which deals with our trade-exposed industry, which deals with the limitations that many of our trade-exposed industries are facing, and allow us to have a Made in Saskatchewan version. Unfortunately, again, most of the details will be left to the regulatory stage, and we won't have an opportunity to comment on that in the House, Mr. Speaker. But if this truly meets the requirements of the federal government in Part 2 of their climate bill, and this government has brought something forward that meets their requirements, I think that's a step forward, Mr. Speaker, and I think that's something that we can look as a positive change in our Saskatchewan environment. Again, it's been since 2009 that this has been promised, but I think we are ever hopeful, and I think those are what the changes for the current Section 61 is all about. There's been a few more changes made to the act that was brought in December of 2017, and that's the 2012 version of the bill with the amendment. And this is the audits and inspections changes. Really not a lot of changes that that are being brought in, except I think wherever it said enforcement officer, it now reads environment officer. So it's a minor change there. It's, I think, an administrative change. Many of the penalties and offenses clauses are now repealed in Part 9, but they are replaced with a few new clauses, and they're fairly administrative as well, Mr. Speaker. So in terms of those changes, there's not a lot to comment on there. The regulations section of the old bill, of the original bill, the 2009 version, the 2012 version, the 2017 version, and this one have morphed significantly as well, and there is a long list of things that can be moved to regulatory or lieutenant governor council. Executive council can make lots of different regulatory regulations in relation to how this bill is going to look. And I think if we look at that clause in the most recent version of the bill, it has a lot of things in it. I really am tempted to read the whole thing out into the record, Mr. Speaker, but it would just take too long.
We're good.
My colleague's okay with it,
It'll be the first time they've heard it.
Well, maybe. I think what I'll do, Mr. Speaker, is share a few of them anyways for the benefit of the people sitting here today anyways. So, for example, the definition of CO2e in Section 2, which I talked about before, they can now prescribe the manner for determining the CO2e amount and the global warming potential for each particular greenhouse gas. And Mr. Speaker, that's something that was talked a lot about in the Myers-Norris Penny consultations this spring, and I think there's been a lot written on this, because how you determine CO2e, there are many ways to skin that cat, Mr. Speaker, and I think some people would have more interest in using a limited definition, and other people would have more interest in an expanded definition. So again, until we know exactly which way this government goes through the regulations, we really won't be able to comment on whether the mechanism for determining the amount of CO2e is going to be only revealed to us once we see the regulations. Again, for the purposes of the definition of greenhouse 2, they're reserving the amount in regulation to prescribe additional greenhouse gases. For the purposes of a definition of offset credit in Section 2 respecting offset credits. Now, I haven't talked about those at all. They're new in the new bill. And this is a way where the heavy emitters can actually apply for credits in their own tech fund bank account per se, Mr. Speaker, if that's the way it goes. So there's all sorts of regulations now that will be made in relation to the offset credits. Let's just take a look at the offset credits themselves. Offset credits mean a credit for any prescribed activity that reduces the emission of greenhouse gases, sequesters greenhouse gases, captures greenhouse gases, and prevents their release into the atmosphere. Now, if you can imagine, Mr. Speaker, this could happen. I could actually help with this because I could sequester greenhouse gases in my garden if I wanted to. So I could also capture greenhouse gases, I don't know, through different materials in the building of my house, although it's already built, but I could maybe use better windows. So that would sequester greenhouse gases and it would reduce emissions. So it's not clear who gets to claim these offset credits, but if we look at the regulation section in Section 84 sub 1, D, we see that for the purposes of the definition of offset credit in Section 2 respecting offset credits, they can make regulations prescribing activities that may qualify as a generating offset credit and prescribing the manner in which offset credits may be used and the terms and conditions that must be complied with in order to use offset credits, and authorizing the minister to determine the manner in which offset credits may be used and the terms and conditions that must be complied with in order to use offset credits. So there we have again, Mr. Speaker, there's a definition in the Act, but we really don't have any idea what it means until we find out what the regulations are. and that's a bit of a problem. But that's the way the cookie is crumbling in this particular bill. Other regulatory authorities, again, E, for the purposes of the definition of regulated emitter, in Section 2, prescribing regulated emitters and the requirements to determine who is a regulated emitter or a member of a class of regulated emitters. So again, we have a brand new definition, regulated emitter, but they are prescribed people or persons who are members of a class of prescribed people. And in fact, the word prescribed shows up 3 times in the definition, Mr. Speaker. So how is that for clarity? It's a bit of a murky world we're in here. For the purposes of Section 5, establishing a greenhouse gas emission reduction target for Saskatchewan. So how on earth are we going to know where we're headed if we don't know where we're going, Mr. Speaker? And in terms of that definition, greenhouse gas emissions reduction target used to be in the Act as a greenhouse gas emission baseline. And then I think in Bill 126, it remained as the greenhouse gas emission baseline. In the Act brought in force last December was still the baseline, and I think that's still the same definition, greenhouse gas emission baseline. So that hasn't changed at all. We still don't know what the baseline is, though. So we've had 9 years to find out where this baseline is.
The blowing sand.
Yeah, a line in the blowing sand. Very good description by my colleague sitting beside me from Saskatoon Centre. So for the purposes of Section 5, the greenhouse reduction target. So I just want to look at the old Section 5 and see if we can figure out where they're going. The original Section 5, I'm going to make sure I got the right bill here, was Lieutenant Governor shall establish a greenhouse gas emission reduction target for Saskatchewan for a year or years selected by the Lieutenant Governor and Council. So the idea was that we had a baseline and we also had a target. Let's see what happened in the 2012 version. There it is, the same version, Mr. Speaker. And in 2017, I don't think that changed either. Yes, they will establish a reduction target. And in this version of the bill, it looks like Section 5 is not being amended. It is not being amended. So we still know we're still going to have a target. It's quite exciting, Mr. Speaker. We're going to have a target for emissions reductions, but we don't know what it is yet. Although I have to say, with fairness, the ministry has announced that they hope to reduce emissions, I think it's 10% of the regulated emitters, which unfortunately is only 1.1% of our total emissions in the province. But I think after all this time, we do have a tentative target for tentative target. Well, TBD. It could be a TBD, or it just could be a hopeful target. But there is a target that has been established by the word of the minister and his staff, but we haven't actually seen the regulation yet. So because that is now in the purview of the Lieutenant Governor and Council, who will establish that greenhouse gas emission reduction target for Saskatchewan. There's all kinds of other regulatory authorities being handed over here, performance credits, compliance obligations, things that the minister has to consider when determining other amounts of CO2 that they may deduct when calculating greenhouse gas emissions, dates, and authorizing the minister to determine dates, the manner of calculating the baseline emission level, including authorizing the minister to determine the manner of calculating the baseline emission level. And these are things that were brought up and seriously discussed with the Myers-Norris-Penny folks earlier this year. And the heavy emitters really need to know what these numbers are going to be, Mr. Speaker. So it's a bit of a concern. Dates for returns, prescribing entities and programs with respect to which reports must be made, how requests are dealt with under Section 61, circumstances when the minister has to get the approval of the Lieutenant Governor and Council. And again, I think that's rather interesting that back in the day the minister didn't need the approval to sign agreements, but all of a sudden, the minister has to check in with Lieutenant Governor and Council before going off on his or her own. So I think there's a story there somewhere, Mr. Speaker. W. So this is, we're still under the Lieutenant Governor and Council may make regulations W with respect to any matter governed by this Act, adopting as amended from time to time all or any part of any standard or guideline, amending for the purposes of this Act the regulations or the code, any standard or guideline adopted pursuant to subclause 1, and III, requiring compliance with the standard or guideline adopted pursuant to subclause I. And
I'll get you some more.
That's, again, putting a lot of reliance on the Lieutenant Governor and Council to govern what the code will look like, and gives them a lot of opportunities to be able to change it as need be. So it's the shifting sands that that we are dealing with here that I think are concerning. Even adopting a code, Mr. Speaker, I think, I'm going to just double check the previous version of the bill, and I'm not sure adopting a code was in the regulations at that time. Oh no, it was there, Mr. Speaker, but I don't think it was in the regulations for the first version of the bill, and I think that's something that is significant because I think the confidence in the minister to be able to do this on their own was co-opted at some point, and definitely did not need the Lieutenant Governor and Council's approval to make the code. So we see a much more involved presence with the Lieutenant Governor and Council, and obviously that is the Cabinet, Mr. Speaker, in this bill than we saw in the first version of it. So that raises some questions, and I'm not sure we'll ever get those answers, but it certainly makes me curious, at the least, as to why Lieutenant Governor and Council has stepped in such a way during the evolution of this particular piece of legislation. Now, there's this new thing called performance credit as well. This is a very new part of this bill, which wasn't in any other iterations. And I'm just going to look at that definition, performance credit. Right, a performance credit, as now defined, means, subject to the regulations, a credit expressed in CO2e that is approved by the minister for a regulated emitter whose actual emissions for a compliance period are below the emissions prescribed for that regulated emitter. And so, Mr. Speaker, it's kind of like having a bank balance, and that's making a deposit in your tech fund bank balance. And again, we know that heavy emitters are looking to have their own line item in the technology fund where if they get a performance credit, it'll be for them, and if they pay into the fund, that will be reserved for them when they can reduce their emissions. So it's I guess, evolving, and maybe that's why we have all of this regulatory prescriptions for the performance credits. So that's under Section Y of Section 70 or 84.1. We're still talking about the regulatory authorities, and I think I have 2 or 3 more pages to go through, Mr. Speaker, but we will get there. So for the purposes of the definition of performance credit in Section 2 and Clause 7, Sub 2, Sub P.1, respecting performance credits, they can make regulations including I, determining the manner in which the performance credits may be awarded to a regulated emitter, II, determining a threshold of emissions before performance credits may be awarded, and III, prescribing the manner in which performance credits may be used and the terms and conditions that must be complied with in order to use them. So again, you see Lieutenant Governor and Council having a lot of authority in determining how these performance credits are going to be accessed by the regulated emitters. And I think we need to be very clear here too, Mr. Speaker, the way the tech fund is being set up, it's only regulated emitters at this point that will have access to it, and I know there are concerns about that being raised as well. Definition of qualified person, they can make regs. And again, that's something that when I get to the Mars Norris Penny piece, you'll see that there's a lot of concerns about how the qualified persons are going to be chosen and how they're going to do their work. The compliance option, this is something we haven't talked about yet either.
Especially the flexible compliance.
These are all new as well. There's three things: the compliance obligation, the compliance option, and the compliance period. These are all new definitions. We'll have to ask the minister a little bit more and his officials when we get into committee about those. So the compliance obligation in Section 2 means the action that a regulated emitter is required to take pursuant to this Act and the regulations if the regulated emitter's emissions exceed the emissions prescribed for that regulated emitter. So if I understand this correctly, Mr. Speaker, this is what happens when a heavy emitter goes above the cap that will be set for that heavy emitter. Then there's this thing called compliance options. It means a prescribed method by which a regulated emitter may satisfy its compliance obligation. So what I read in that, Mr. Speaker, is that if you can't pay into the fund, there may be other options for you. And I think that's the newness in this version of the Act. I think it's a whole new flexibility for the heavy emitters to not be required to actually make a cash payment into the fund. And then there's the compliance period, which is a prescribed period. So if we go back to the pretzel approach. A pretzel approach. It's flexible. It's bendy. And so in Section 84 sub 1 now, let's see what's happening with these compliance options. This is in subsection AA. It says, for the purposes of the definition of compliance option in Section 2 and Clause 7 sub P.2, respecting compliance options, you can make regulations and determining what credits, payment, or other mechanism constitutes a compliance option. So there's a lot of room there, Mr. Speaker, I think for us to find some of that pretzelness in this particular section of the bill. You know, I think earlier and through all the previous 10 years that we've been talking about this bill, it was always a payment into a fund. But suddenly we have this compliance option. So it's an option to making the compliance payment. And I think emitters will be happy to know that they have some options that won't actually require cash payments. But will that be enough to incent them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions? Because above all, and for no other reason, this Act is designed to get greenhouse gas emissions reduced here in this province, to meet our Kyoto requirements, to meet our Paris requirements, to meet our international requirements, and the accords that we have signed as a nation. So I'm not sure how compliance options will incent heavy emitters to reduce their emissions. It sounds a lot like cap and trade, Mr. Speaker. They're not calling it that, but you know, in the cap and trade systems where you can continue to pollute as long as you got somebody who's not polluting less that can buy your overpollution. So I think it's concerning, and again, we'll have to see this once the regulations come out. I don't know how the ministry is going to manage to get all these regulations ready for January 1, if that's indeed when this bill will come into force. I think that's the intention of this government. But it's going to take a long, hard look, and I think it'll take quite some time to sort of determine whether these regulations make sense, whether they are, if they're going to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Again, we're talking about management and reduction of greenhouse gases in this bill, and we need to make sure that that happens, Mr. Speaker. Section BB of the regulatory clause talks about programs for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, including, and this is for the purposes of Section 16.1. So let's just take a quick look at 16.1. These are, oh yeah, so there's a new section, 16.1, that didn't exist in the last 9 years. Required greenhouse gas reduction programs. So it says, in accordance with the prescribed programs, prescribed regulated emitters shall reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, A, in the prescribed manner, B, through the prescribed means, and C, by the prescribed date. So in that sentence, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Prescribed is used 5 times in one sentence, Mr. Speaker. Interesting. And subject to the regulations, this is subsection 2, so again we have the regulations. Any regulated emitter that does not reduce its greenhouse gas emissions as required by subsection 1 accrues a compliance obligation, which we don't know what that is, but we will soon find out. Again, in subsection 3, every regulated emitter that accrues a compliance obligation shall fulfill that compliance obligation in the prescribed manner and by the prescribed date. So back to the regs. What does that mean? For the purposes of section 16.1, respecting programs for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by regulated emitters, the regulations could I, establish the program, I, prescribe the regulated emitters or classes of regulated emitters who are subject to the program, I, establishing the basis on which regulated emitters are required to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, including on an absolute basis or an emissions intensity basis. Mr. Speaker, that's really important. There's a big difference between absolute basis or emissions intensity basis. I have some comments I'll be making later about the difference between those two things. This, under section 16.1, they can also make regulations prescribing dates by which the emissions are to be reduced, or establishing compliance obligations, the manner in which the compliance obligations must be fulfilled, and many other things. So, Mr. Speaker, you can see that section 16.1 is a very, very important part of the new version, the new improved version of this act. Kind of like Tide. It just gets better all the time. So it's really difficult to provide comment on the floor of this legislature, as I said before, because of the restrictions or the amount of activity that's going to happen in the regulatory sphere. And I know there's a ton of things that have to happen before this government is able and ready to start prescribing these things and picking these dates and deciding if it's going to be absolute emissions or intensity emissions, and it's just really hard for us to get a sense of it here in the legislature. Even if we spend a lot of time in committee looking at this, we can only ask the government to let us know what they think will be in the regulations, and maybe we might get some clarity that way. There's also a fairly long section CC in the regulatory section, section 84, for the technology fund and what's happening there. So there's all kinds of things that the cabinet will be doing. They'll establish purposes for which monies may be used, prescribing other purposes for the use of monies in the technology fund. So there may be other uses outside of the heavy emitters uses, but we don't know. Terms, conditions, restrictions, criteria for approval of applications to the fund, prescribing the manner in which and the dates by which applications to the tech fund may be made, prescribing information that must be retained, whose application has been approved, and there's a few other things there too. The rate of interest is going to be as prescribed by, in section D, prescribed by regulation, and E, how to be registered and how the regulated emitters will be registered. And there's a few other things in here, F, prescribing environment officers or classes of environment officers who are peace officers, and prescribing any other manner of thing, and so on and so on. So, Mr. Speaker, it's a really heavy on the regulatory side type of bill. And again, if this government wants to come into compliance with the federal Act under Part 2. Obviously, we know their position on Part 1, and the courts now will have an opportunity to weigh in on that as well. But under Part 2, the heavy emitters part of the federal bill, this could, and I think we are assured that this will meet the requirements of the federal bill, and they'll actually stand down the federal bill. But for January 1st, there's a whole lot of questions we have about how it's going to unfold, and I'm sure the heavy emitters have the same questions. The federal bill has been around for a while, but I think the ministry felt there was a need for extensive consultation with who will be the heavy emitters, and as you know, they're fairly described in Prairie Resilience. So it's going to be tough, and I think we're going to have a lot of questions as that goes forward. Now, I just want to talk about a few other things, Mr. Speaker, and actually quite a few other things. First of all, I want to talk about the Go Green Fund. And as you know, this was established by the previous government in terms of there was a sale of the heavy oil upgrader in Lloydminster, and that was about $300 million. And the previous government committed to use the sale of that to look at a Go Green Fund and actually fund activities within the province of Saskatchewan, not initiated by government, not initiated in many cases by industry, but just by towns, villages, First Nations, people with good ideas, Mr. Speaker. And once the Sask Party came into government in 2007, that shifted quite a bit, actually, Mr. Speaker. Instead of $300 million, we were seeing more like 700 or 70 million, sorry. Or 60 million would be even more accurate. And if you go on the Environment's webpage, it's still on their webpage. It's on the Green Living page, and it's called the Go Green Fund. And here's how it's currently described by this government. The Go Green Fund was a $60 million commitment between 2008 and 2015 by the Government of Saskatchewan to help people, communities, non-government organizations, and business address the province's most important environmental issues. Now, it was way before 2008, Mr. Speaker, so there's an error there. And it was a lot more money at one point, Mr. Speaker, so there's another error there. But it's funny, they still have it on the webpage. When it died in 2015, that abruptly ended. And I remember when that was announced. And so they go on to say, well, the Go Green Fund is no longer accepting applications at this time. It did support more than 60 environmental initiatives that helped contribute to the following objectives. And they talk about reduction or avoidance of greenhouse gases, conservation of water supplies, maintenance or restoration of water quality to meet established standards, biodiversity conservation, reduction of waste, and enhanced education and public awareness of priority environmental issues. As you know, Mr. Speaker, the environment is very broad, and the concerns that our environment is facing are incredibly broad. Obviously, greenhouse gas emissions is #1 concern these days because of the problems we're facing as a planet. But that doesn't mean we don't have needs in terms of biodiversity, in terms of waste reduction, in terms of better education, water quality. So all of those things were being covered by the Go Green Fund, and despite trumpeting it in a number of circumstances, it got wiped out. I'm just going to turn now to some of the comments that were made in this assembly about those early heady years when the bill was first introduced. And for example, in the Go Green, we have a statement, ministerial statement from April 22nd, 2008, where the minister said, "It gives me real satisfaction as this government's first Minister of Environment to stand in the legislature and confirm our commitment to the environment. This year we have committed an additional $10 million to fund green initiatives in Saskatchewan. This is in keeping with our promise to the people of Saskatchewan to more than double the funding for green initiatives." Promise made, Mr. Speaker, and now it's a promise broken. That is not anymore on the books. It's long gone. So it's really unfortunate. And she went on to say, Mr. Speaker, the money will be used to deliver on our commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Saskatchewan by 32% by the year 2020. Those were promises made to the people of Saskatchewan before the 2007 election. 32%, and I believe it was 2006 levels, although it's not here, by the year 2020. We're just about at 2019, Mr. Speaker, and do you know how much our greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced? They haven't been reduced at all. They've gone up since this government came into power, and they certainly have not ever identified a way to reduce 32% by 2020. But, oh yeah, and she went on to say at the end of her ministerial statement, our government is committed to making sure people of Saskatchewan have the support they need to make the choices that count. And there was a response to that ministerial statement from the opposition, and the opposition wanted to point out that, and I'm quoting, they cut the Green Initiatives Fund from $320 million to a $40 million commitment on their behalf. They abolished the Office of Energy Conservation, and they also abolished the Office of Climate Change Secretariat. So you hear a bit of a different story, Mr. Speaker, if you read on and see what the response of the opposition is to that. Bill 126 second reading was on December 2nd, 2009. So this was the second version of the Act in 2009. And the Minister said this in her second reading speech, and I quote, "The sustained growth of our economy can come at a high environmental price due to increased greenhouse gas emissions from coal-fired power plants, oil and gas production, and other sectors. As a result, Saskatchewan accounts for 10% of the total Canadian greenhouse gas emissions, but only 3% of our country's population." She went on to say, now this is a little bit of a change from April 22nd, 2008. So it's about 18 months later. And she said, "Our government has adopted a target of emissions by 20% by 2020 from 2006 levels." So Mr. Speaker, I'm getting some respect here from the other side, and I honestly, appreciate that a lot. It's very welcome. Thank you very much. What I'm concerned about right now is that within 18 months we get a completely different target from this government. The government adopted a target of emissions by 20% by 2020 from 2006 levels. What happened to 32%, Mr. Speaker? 18 short months earlier, the minister was bragging about a 32% reduction. That's what they talked about in the election in 2007. And then magically, it turned into 20%. Strange how these things happen, Mr. Speaker. She went on to talk about the legislation. She says, "The legislation creates two other institutions as central parts of our program. One is the Climate Change Foundation, which will receive any unused funds from the Tech Fund to promote research and development and the demonstration of cost-effective emissions-reducing technologies. The foundation will be responsible for public education and adaptation planning. It will work with regulated and non-regulated sectors to develop innovative solutions for reducing emissions and adapting to warmer temperatures and extreme weather conditions." Well, Mr. Speaker, we don't have the Climate Change Foundation anymore. Quietly, silently, it has been eliminated. Kind of like a Netflix murder show in a way. It's just eliminated. We don't know. Oh, I caught you on that one. Not maybe, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you don't like my analogies? Yeah. Okay. So anyways, it's gone. The Climate Change Foundation is now gone, despite these lofty words that the minister used on December 2nd of 2009. Here's what she went on to say. "Secondly, an Office of Climate Change will be established for the Ministry of Environment to administer the climate change program and introduce other related aspects of the plan, including offsets, pre-certified investments, those are gone, credit for early action, and other related regulations. This office will also draft additional practice and guidance documents in a code to assist industry with the technical and legal aspects of the regulatory compliance." And here she gives a nod to her federal comrades. "When the new federal climate change program is in place, Canada will sign an equivalency agreement with Saskatchewan will sign an equivalency agreement with Canada, allowing our provincial legislation and regulations to provide outcomes equivalent to the federal plan. Saskatchewan has already signed an agreement in principle with the federal government to conclude these negotiations once both the federal and provincial legislation and regulations have been passed." Well, Mr. Speaker, how things have changed. Again, the Office of Climate Change has been silently and effectively eliminated. It's not there anymore, it doesn't exist, and it is completely repealed from the bill that passed through this House in 2010, Mr. Speaker. So those are the kinds of talk, that's the talk we had 9.5 years ago, but it's not the walk that we're seeing right now. Moving forward, we had a number of people from the official opposition provide comment on Bill 126, including the former member for Lakeview. And he talked a lot about what I've already talked about, was the idea that, and I'll quote him, "The number of clauses, the number of words, the number of things that are in the Act that are to be defined subsequently by the Minister, by the Lieutenant Governor and Council, it's not entirely clear with who sometimes, but it's most everything that's in this act is subject to some kind of change at a later point. And it's quite fascinating to see that legislation that is as crucial as this will end up without anybody really knowing what the legislation means until the regulations are brought forward. So that was one of the things he said at page 4276 on March 16th, 2010. And he was concerned with the brevity of the minister's second reading speech, and he said this, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, we're into a new generation of legislation where the minister gives a very short explanation bringing it forward. He said maybe because she doesn't know exactly what is here, but I think maybe more importantly because she doesn't necessarily want to define what she's introduced. And he goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, I say this legislation allows for a change on the go policy to exist as we move forward as well. And I don't think that's fair to business people, I don't think that's fair to the public, and I don't think it's fair to the staff within the department who are supposed to be trying to administer this. He has a few things to say about the code, and I've commented on that a little bit myself, but here's what he said on March 16th. He says, so it appears that the code is actually the core of the bill, but we don't know what that is. We don't know where and how it's going to be defined. We know that there's a similar code in the other environmental legislation that the Chamber of Commerce is upset about, and they in actual fact make a comment. And he goes on to quote the Chamber of Commerce with some criticism about the government being less than forthcoming when it applies to how the industry will be affected by these changes. He talks a lot about the code and under Section 83, the regulatory authorities that I've talked about a lot about. The baseline, he also had a lot to say about that too. And here's what he said, Mr. Speaker. It seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that when the Sask Party ran in the last election, they had some pretty clear goals and pretty clear things they said in their platform as it relates to this particular subject. Those things that are not in this legislation, those things are not in this legislation. I mean, in fact, the legislation itself says the Lieutenant Governor and Council may establish a greenhouse gas emission baseline for Saskatchewan for a year, selected by the Lieutenant Governor and Council. Now, if we went back and looked at the platform, we could fill all that in, and it would have been very clear what this legislation was about, and we would have some clear rules for everybody who's involved. Now, practically, we know that's a problem because the time this bill was introduced a few months ago and now, that particular line has been changed. And we know that there's going to be some other changes and adjustments because we don't think that there's clear leadership from the government on what they're going to do in this particular area. And he went on to talk about the Section 6 in that version of the bill, and he says, we know that the targets are in the previous paragraphs and they're still sort of out there somewhere or coming from Mount Sinai, or we don't know where they're coming from. And basically it goes on to say that the minister can use any indicators that the minister considers relevant in preparation of a report. Well, I'm not sure if you can be as, well, I don't know what's the word, mushy or fuzzy or unclear as this particular legislation appears to be. He went on for quite a bit of length. He talked about Part 5 of the legislation at page 4279, and he said this, Part 5 of the legislation says there's going to be an Office of Climate Change established. This is established right within the ministry, and it sets out the rules about how that's done. That seems to be relatively clear what's going to be. I think it is something that is once again a good idea. It probably replaces some things that were removed or eliminated quite recently, but I think I'd give that one the benefit of the doubt because it clearly will end up having some precedents from the previous government as to how to operate and actually probably can do some good work. So, Mr. Speaker, as you know, there was an Office of Climate Change established by the previous government, and that was actually wiped out when this government came into power, but there was some hope that at some point that Office of Climate Change would be re-established, and clearly in 2009, 2010, that was the intention of this government. In fact, until just this bill was introduced, it was the intention of this government. So it lasted for 9 years, and then now it's just kind of been eliminated. And he goes on to say on page 4280, now there's also an intention, it appears here, to set up a climate change or climate research and development fund, and this is, I think, once again, a good idea. Clearly, the issue there will be what kind of funds will be made available to make sure that this fund continues in existence. And once again, is to be a fund that's outside the Crown, and I think that it can serve a good purpose. Once again, it's in how it's implemented and how the resources are provided to it, and I think that that's something we're going to have to watch very carefully. It's an area where there could have been more clarity or definition or description in the second reading speech from the minister, but it wasn't there. Well, I'll tell you what's not there right now, Mr. Speaker. The Research and Development Fund itself. Once again, it's been eliminated, and it is gone as of the introduction of this bill, if this bill passes through the House. So he went to talk quite a bit about the lack of detail and the devolution to the legislative or regulatory authorities. And he was worried about targets, that there weren't targets here. And he went on to speak about that at length as well. Moving forward a little bit to budget speeches in March of 2010. And again, the Minister of the Day indicated in her budget speech the following, and I quote on page 45-43, "This budget sees the continuation of our campaign promise to commit $15 million per year to our Go Green Fund. This fund offers financing to enable people to go green and make the changes necessary to help our environment and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions." Well, Mr. Speaker, we already know what happened to the Go Green Fund. It's gone. And unfortunately, the Minister's budget speech of 2010 was not a harbinger of the future. It was a continuation of a campaign promise. And as we all know, that promise has been broken. Shame, Mr. Speaker. April 28th, 2010, we move on to a continuation of the debate on the Bill 126. And this time it's my colleague from Regina Elphinstone Centre. And he had a few things to say as well about the promises that were made and then broken. He was concerned because during the election campaign, there was some debate about what percentage reduction we would see in greenhouse gas emissions. And he said, and this is quoting him on page 5193, "One of the planks in our platform that we put forward and had different measures, cash on the table to back it up, Mr. Deputy Speaker, was the plank around the 32% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions." And it was most interesting that, of course, the Sask Party, as represented by the member from Martensville, the now Minister of the Environment, in that debate, their position as regarded greenhouse gas reductions was, well, the NDP position is our position, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And it sounded kind of phony baloney at the time. I'll have to say that, Mr. Speaker. But it's always kind of interesting that if somebody is willing to get up in front of a crowd of young people and say whatever they think they want to hear, and then once they get elected and do something completely opposite. When I reference the young people that get cynical or aren't engaged in the process, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and there are a lot of different people that are disengaged with our system, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's a stereotype of politicians who will say anything to get elected, who will get up and tell you whatever you want to hear, but come getting elected then, it's a different story entirely. And in terms of typifying that kind of behavior that drives people out of the process in droves and that should be met at the ballot box with a certain answer, Mr. Deputy Speaker, well, that's the kind of behavior that we now clearly realize is on display by the member of Martensville. So when asked about their greenhouse reduction targets, the member from Martensville said, "We're with the NDP. We think that's a reachable target. Thank you very much. Next question." He goes on to say, "So it was good enough during the election, and they take great pride in putting up promises on their website in terms of a promise made is a promise kept." And he goes on to say, "So when it comes to something they've very blatantly broken in terms of the promise around greenhouse gas reduction targets, well, it wasn't months after the election, where in the election they promised a 32% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, then last May and again last December, they reduced it to 20%. And again, very interesting, Mr. Speaker. But as of today, he goes on page 5194, as far as we understand what the members opposite are saying, and again, you'll forgive us if we have some trouble, some challenge in following the bouncing ball of the way things proceed over there. Mr. Deputy Speaker, what's the target today? As far as we understand it, it's 17%. So 32% promised in the election and 17% as of today. And I'm sure that there were other members that got up on platforms throughout the province and talked to people that were concerned about the environment and concerned about green issues. And they said, yes, we're in for that 32% reduction for the 2020, just like the NDP. Nothing to see here. Please move along. Just, you know, close your eyes and think about this. Hope trumps fear and a brand new government is coming in. And isn't our leader witty in all of this? But of course, the substance has been a very different thing, Mr. Speaker. So it went from 32% come election time, and what the people over there had to say on platforms across this province and what they had to say in their election platform itself, Mr. Speaker, which, you know, you hear the Premier say different fancy things about what that is and how that should be a covenant with people. Well, if this is the old times, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the Old Testament, I think somebody would be coming down the mountain to tell them what they'd done with that covenant. So today's target, now 17%.
What happened to that leader?
And then what happened to that leader is a good question by my colleague, Mr. Speaker. He says, well, how can you believe them on that, Mr. Speaker, if they can't even meet the obligation that they set out on their platform and that they stood on stages throughout this province at election time and said, you know, 32% reduction by 2020, we're on board. So if you can't even get that right, Mr. Speaker, how is it that, you know, somehow the national and international obligations are going to be met? Following my colleague from Elphinstone was my colleague from Saskatoon Centre, and he had a few things to say about this as well on April 28, 2010. This is on page 5195, and I'm sure you're very excited to know what he had to say, Mr. Speaker, so I'm going to read that for you. He's talking about Bill 126 and the emission baseline, and he says, and we talk about Section 4, greenhouse gas emission baseline, and this is really the part that I find kind of shocking, because if you read the press release, when it talks about the reduction, they have real targets. But then Section 4 says the Lieutenant Governor and Council may establish a greenhouse gas emission baseline for Saskatchewan for a year selected by the Lieutenant Governor and Council. Well, that's got real teeth. That's got real teeth. I can't believe that. That's really something. This is really binding legislation. You may establish a greenhouse gas emission baseline for Saskatchewan? Wow, that's got to be, they worked very hard on that one. Now, who wrote that? Who wrote that? For a year, selected by the Governor and Council? Wow, we picked the years, and then we picked the baseline, and then we may get around to it. And he says, he goes on, now here's the next part where they say in their press release, now the minister wasn't misquoted here because she didn't really actually say it. It was her writers who talked about 20% from 2006 by 2020. And here we got Section 5. The Lieutenant Governor and Council shall establish a greenhouse gas emission baseline or emission reduction target for Saskatchewan for a year or years selected by the Lieutenant Governor and Council. So, real teeth. He goes on to talk about an article that was written by Murray Mandrick in the Leader Post in May of 2009. And it was about, the headline, it was called Saskatchewan Adopts Harper's Hot Air Plan. So this is Murray Mandrick's take on the promise of a 32% reduction. And this is what he said in the Leader Post. Even if one accepts the Sask Party's premise that its own 2007 campaign promise of a 32% reduction in greenhouse gases was just too costly to the provincial economy, and more in a moment on how the Environment Ministry sounds far too much like an Economic Development Ministry, why did it have to be 20%? Why not a 25% reduction? Well, the only magical thing about a 20% emission reduction target is that it happens to be the same as the federal Conservative government's, which take us to the biggest problem with this supposed Made in Saskatchewan strategy. It's really a Made in Ottawa strategy. It's bad enough Premier Bradwell's government now has to break its own election promise to appease the federal government, but Wall must also again deal with the perception his government is too closely tied to that of Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And about the last area in which the Sask Party should want to be tied to the federal Tories is the environment and greenhouse gas emissions.
So true. So true.
Kind of a premonition there, Mr. Speaker.
Me too.
I'm going to go on to April 28, 2010, and this is still my colleague from Saskatoon Centre. he's winding it up, and he says, it's a meaningless piece of law unless we know what those two pieces are. What's the baseline, and what year are they talking about? So, Mr. Speaker, very clear concerns from my colleagues back in the day in 2010 when the bill was first being cycled around. Now I'm just going to move ahead to 2012 where we had the amendments that I talked about before, and I don't have much to say about that at this point other than some comments that my previous colleague from Regina Lakeview, Mr. John Nelson, had to say on March 4th, 2013. And he's talking again about the Go Green Fund, and I just want to make sure that this is on the record. He says, quote, this is page 2487, "Now I know from personal experience as the former Minister of Environment that when we sold the upgrader in Regina, the goal was to set aside that $300 million to deal with a number of these issues. Eventually, $30 million out of the $300 million was used for that. The other money went other places and it's disappeared. But Mr. Speaker, the goal there was to use money from an asset that did have an impact on the environment to actually go and address a number of these issues. And unfortunately, the last 5 or 6 years of this government has seen a steady diminishment in the size of the Environment Department and in their oversight and in some of the activities they do. And so, Mr. Speaker, I think those are valid concerns then, and I think they continue to be valid concerns. Moving forward, we now have Bill 48, which is the 2012 version. Oh yeah, this is the same time. We're just going to go ahead to March 6th, where again my colleague from Elphinstone Centre had some comments on the amendments made in March of 2013. And this is what he said. He said, "And certainly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I remember well the 2007 election. I certainly remember sharing a platform with the Sask Party representatives at the University of Regina. And the Sask Party platform at the time was, the emission reduction targets set by the NDP. We're on board for those. The Climate Change Fund that has been secured to the tune of $300 million, we're in favor of that as well. And it's interesting to see how things are campaigned on, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and then how they translate after the campaign is over and after a government takes charge. So, the emission targets that had been signed onto by the members opposite and by the then new government, of course, were not met and were revised downward, downward, and downward. And there were games played with, problem solving through redefinition, trying to juke the stats, as they might say in The Wire, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But in terms of real action, in terms of climate change reduction, not so much. And when it came to the Climate Change Fund, and with $300 million that were in the $300 million that were in the Climate Change Fund, and I hear my colleague from Saskatoon Silver Springs, the current Minister from the Environment across the way, it's difficult not to hear him. But I'm going to skip ahead, I'm sure he would own up to the fact that the campaign in 2007 by the Sask Party said one thing, and then after they got elected, they did another. I'll go on to the bottom of page 2573, and they said when they talked about climate change reduction, they're like, yes, us. When it came to the Climate Change Fund, they're like, sign us up. And it didn't take very long after the election for that to go by the wayside, Mr. Speaker, for the $300 million fund to be chopped down to $30 million, and then for that $30 million fund to, in the branding of Go Green and all this, to eventually be gone and be eliminated from the government program offerings altogether. So that is some of the comments that were made in the past on this same bill, Mr. Speaker, in its previous iterations. I looked back to the Economy Committee and all the promises of the Go Green Fund back in 2009 in estimates for the environment. There was a commitment to the Go Green Fund, and as you know, in 2015 that was eliminated altogether. And so there's quite a few comments there. Just to continue, I think, maybe before I continue on the timeline, I do want to talk a little bit about the Pan-Canadian framework, because this is the federal framework that was established by almost all the provinces. Saskatchewan, of course, walked out. But it is a very comprehensive framework, and it's entitled Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And I just want to touch on a few of the areas that I think are quite positive in this plan, and I think we can actually see movement here in the province on some of them, and in particular the bill we're talking about today, Mr. Speaker, because on page 20 of the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, they talk about industry, and this is 3.4 in the plan. I just want to highlight some of the comments in there. It says methane and HFCs are potent GHGs, dozens to thousands of times more powerful than carbon dioxide. The oil and gas sector is the largest contributor to methane emissions in Canada. Building on provincial actions and targets, the federal government has committed to reduce methane emissions by 40 to 45% by 2025. And although we haven't actually seen the regulations yet, Mr. Speaker, we know that in Prairie Resilience there was a commitment by this government to reduce those emissions. Methane is deadly when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, and definitely in the, I think they call it the upstream oil and gas industry, this is one of the biggest concerns that's happening. And I remember a few years ago when there was photographs from space showing satellites, showing the flaring in the state, I think it was North Dakota, it could have been Montana, but I think it was North Dakota, where you could actually see the light coming from all of the flaring in a satellite picture. And when you think about the emissions that are being burned or simply vented, flared or vented into the atmosphere, I don't know if it's a low-hanging fruit, Mr. Speaker. We know the government introduced some guidelines, S10 and S15, I think were introduced quite a few years ago to encourage oil and gas companies to either capture some of those associated gases or at least sell them for profit. I mean, we know that natural gas is another gas that's considered to be an associated gas. And the idea, though, and these were simply guidelines at the time, was that if they weren't economical, if there wasn't an economical way to capture these gases and perhaps market them, that they wouldn't have to take any action. And of course, Mr. Speaker, as you can imagine, in order to capitalize on the, make an economic gain on the capturing of these gases, you require some sort of transportation system for the gases, and there was none available, and industry did not find a way amongst themselves to create that transportation system that would make it economical. I haven't been able to get a lot of detail on how much gas was captured through those guidelines. I've done some written questions on it, but I know the Minister, and I'll talk about it a little bit when I get to Prairie Resilience, but I know the Minister has indicated that there are regulations coming, and my only response to that is that it can't be too soon. On page 21 of the Pan-Canadian Framework, there's something called new actions. So on each one of the headings, the federal government indicates new actions. And on this one, reducing methane and HFC emissions, they say this, quote, "The federal government will work with provinces and territories to achieve the objective of reducing methane emissions from the oil and gas sector, including offshore activities, by 40 to 45% by 2025, including through equivalency agreements." So that indicates to me that there's still some time. 2025 is a few years off, but we are definitely hopeful that we can start making a move on this sooner than later because of the incredibly damaging effect that the methane emissions have in relation to greenhouse gas emissions. The federal government talks about forestry, agriculture, and waste in the Pan-Canadian Framework. They talk about government leadership, and we've seen recently the City of Regina making that commitment to become, I think, emissions-free by 2050. I can't remember the exact details on that, Mr. Speaker. We see the City of Saskatoon capturing methane at their landfill, Mr. Speaker, and converting it into energy. If you ever have a chance to tour that facility, it's a very interesting facility, and certainly, you know, rather than having it simply vented in the atmosphere, there's a way to capture it, and they're actually generating electricity with it. So I think cities have shown some real leadership in this area, and we have to commend them on that. There's a really important part in this called international leadership, and I think this is something we need to have our federal government, provincial governments work on harder. And it's tough when we have our neighbors to the south of us completely walking back from their Paris commitments. And I know it's really difficult for progressive leaders in the free world to make progress on this because of what's happening in the United States of America. But I hold hope that if it's not through the president himself, it may be through the individual states. And we've seen states like California, Colorado doing some really progressive things in that respect. But on page 26 of the Pan-Canadian framework, the action that's identified there is the federal government, in cooperation with provincial and territorial governments, will work with its international partners to ensure that trade rules support climate policy. And Mr. Speaker, I think that's something where there's been ships passing in the night as of late. When you look at international trade agreements and then you look at international environmental agreements, I think there's a disconnect. And we have to find a way to connect that so that all our international partners on a global basis will be able to work together meaningfully to address this issue. The air doesn't stop at any border. The water doesn't, the oceans don't stop at borders, Mr. Speaker. And, nationalist approaches like the ones we see in the United States of America are simply making the matter worse. And I think at some point we're going to see a much more, we will need to see a much more global integrated effort in order to make any dents in the amount of GHGs that we're putting into the atmosphere. And it's complicated. I mean, I'll be the first to admit that for sure. Page 31 of the Pan-Canadian Framework talks about building climate resilience through infrastructure. And some of the new actions that are identified there is the federal government committing to partner to invest in infrastructure projects that strengthen climate resilience. And Mr. Speaker, I think the federal program on transportation that's recently been announced would certainly go away to helping reduce greenhouse gas emissions if we had a provincial transportation system that could offer people an opportunity to avoid using their own car. As you know, that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but I think what we heard from the minister today was complete repudiation of that money. And I'm not sure why, and his reasons were rather vague, but the money's just being turned away, and that's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker. They talk about other new actions in terms of infrastructure. They will work collaboratively to integrate climate resilience into building designs and codes. In respect to human health and well-being on page 32, the new actions that were agreed upon, and unfortunately Saskatchewan hasn't agreed to this agreement, but most of the rest of Canada has. It says new actions. Governments will collaborate to prevent illness resulting from extreme heat events and to reduce the risks associated with climate-driven infectious diseases such as Lyme disease. And we know Lyme disease is present here in the province, Mr. Speaker, and definitely is becoming much more pervasive as the climate warms. Supporting healthy Indigenous communities. There's a commitment here that the federal government will increase support for First Nations and Inuit communities to undertake climate change and health adaptation projects that protect public health. And also the federal government will work with the Métis Nation on addressing the health effects of climate change. There's actions relating to the north of Canada. And then another thing that we don't talk about a whole lot, but we see it happening all around us, is climate-related hazards and disaster risks. And in the Pan-Canadian Framework, on page 35, the actions that the signatories agreed to were as follows. Federal, provincial, and territorial governments except for Saskatchewan, who hasn't signed it, will partner to invest in traditional and natural infrastructure that reduces disaster risks and protects Canadian communities from climate-related hazards such as flooding and wildfires. And you know, Mr. Speaker, that is something we've seen in Saskatchewan, is flooding and wildfires. So it's too bad we haven't signed on to this. Number 2 is advancing efforts to protect against floods. Federal, provincial, and territorial governments will work together through the National Disaster Mitigation Program to develop and modernize flood maps and assess and address flood risks. And then number 3, supporting adaptation in Indigenous communities. Governments will work in partnership with Indigenous communities to address climate change impacts, including repeated and severe climate impacts related to flooding, forest fires, and failures of winter roads. And we heard that story just recently in the north, Mr. Speaker, where an entire community gets the barge to come once a year, and wasn't able to come this year because the ice froze way sooner than it does. And so they have to fly everything in by one of those big cargo jets or military cargo planes. So it's expensive, it's disruptive. And another piece that I quite enjoy in this Pan-Canadian framework is the section on clean technology, innovation, and jobs, because it provides that bit of hope that maybe we can make a difference, and maybe we can use our technology and our engineering to make a change, Mr. Speaker. And what they say here on page 37 is the window of opportunity exists for Canada to create the conditions for new clean technology investment and exports and seize growing global markets for clean technology, goods, services, and processes. They go on to say Canada needs a step change in clean technology development, commercialization, and adoption across all industrial sectors. So some of the new actions that are identified on page 39 is supporting early stage technology development. And we've seen this government do it with collabs, Mr. Speaker. And I would encourage them to extend that to these environmental breakthrough technologies. So the action identified in the Pan-Canadian framework is governments will support new approaches to early stage technology development, including breakthrough technologies, to advance research in areas that have the potential to substantially reduce GHG emissions and other pollutants. And then number 2, governments will encourage new mission-oriented research approaches to focus RD&D facilities, programs, and supports on clean technology and environmental performance issues. There's some actions that are identified on accelerating commercialization and growth on page 41. Federal, provincial, and territorial governments will work together to create a coordinated, no wrong door approach to supporting Canadian clean technology businesses. Governments will collaborate to enable access to capital for clean technology businesses to bring their product and services to market. And governments will work together to strengthen skills development and business leadership capacity in support of the transition to a low-carbon economy. Those are just a few of the things that I wanted to highlight in the Pan-Canadian framework. I think there's some positive things there where we can work collaboratively across government and all levels of government to start making a dent in some of the damages that are occurring to our environment. Just wanted to go now through some of the documents that I found online that talk about this issue. Again, I have the Saskatchewan press release of May 11th, 2009, when the headline is Saskatchewan takes real action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. May 11th, 2009, so that's almost 10 years ago, Mr. Speaker. And this is when they lowered their hard cap to 20%. And we were told that an equivalency agreement with the federal government is key to Saskatchewan retaining compliance payments in the province for investments in low-carbon technologies. And I again am astounded at how that is so different today, Mr. Speaker. At that time, they announced the establishment of the Tech Fund, the Climate Change Foundation, and the Go Green Fund. And we know that 2 of those are now completely gone, and the Tech Fund is substantially changed. So 10 years does make a difference in government, Mr. Speaker. Even from the Minister's 2013 annual report, it said in its role as administrator of the provincial Go Green Fund, the ministry oversees the development of a diversity of projects in support of the fund's objectives. And the ministry is also responsible for supporting the government-wide climate change program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the province. So again, a reference to the Go Green Fund and the important work that was being done there. 2010 annual report on page 25, 10-11 annual report of the Ministry of Environment, page 25. This is the delivery of the province's Go Green Plan. Results. Administer the Go Green Fund to promote research and development of cost-effective environmental technologies and processes such as carbon capture and storage, energy efficiency and conservation initiatives, water conservation measures, biodiversity conservation initiatives, public education awareness. And it goes on to say the Go Green Fund promotes the development and implementation of cost-effective environmental technologies. On December 20th, 2010, the Go Green Fund issued an open call for letters of intent. Over 120 responses were received, and accepted proposals will receive funding in 2011-12 fiscal year. The Go Green Unit provides extension services for an estimated 300 inquiries per year from parties seeking advice on environmental sustainability. The Ministry of Environment currently manages over 25 Go Green Fund contracts with Saskatchewan businesses, organizations, and communities. So, Mr. Speaker, that was then, this is now, and there is nothing left of that entire report. So again, it's just quite concerning and unfortunate. And we had the Government of Canada's 6th National Report on Climate Change 2014, and Saskatchewan was given kudos for the Go Green Fund and our commitments to the Go Green Fund. And sadly, that is now gone. So I just wanted to highlight that we were getting recognition for that. Now, in 2017, things started happening. This was when Prairie Resilience was announced, and then kudos to the current minister for getting that out the door. December 6, 2017, there was a press release that introduced the coal-fired electricity regulations. We were waiting a long time for that, Mr. Speaker, and as you know, the federal regulations, I believe, were introduced in 2012. I could be wrong, but I think it was 2012. So 5 years later, we get the regulations that are in agreement with the federal government, Mr. Speaker. And so there is a meeting in the minds there, and as a result, the regulations on coal-fired electricity are now in place. We don't know what that means for the future of coal in the province just yet, because the SaskPower is looking for some flexibility in terms of the equivalency agreement on continuing operating coal units. But it's a step forward, and I think it was an important step that we see the federal and the provincial government in sync on, and they're moving forward. Of course, those were Stephen Harper's regulations, so I guess we have him to thank for that. As a result of bringing in those regulations, the government also had to bring in part of the Management and Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Act, because SaskPower is definitely a heavy emitter within the definitions of the Greenhouse Gas Management Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Act. So as a result of these regulations, SaskPower will no longer be subject to the heavy emitter regulations. And as I talked about earlier, that's going to have a significant impact on the technology fund, because I think initially it was thought that as one of the heaviest emitters, SaskPower would be one of the heaviest contributors to the fund. And I'll get into the Myers-Norris Penny agreement very soon on terms of how the other heavy emitters see that. So in terms of the Prairie Resilience, we have one of the things that's in there that's important for people to note is the GHG emissions by economic sector, and this is from 2015, but I think it gives us a good picture of what we're dealing with here. Oil and gas, 32% of the emissions in our sector right now. I think with the intention to bring in regulations to reduce the amount of methane in the upstream oil and gas industry, we will see a reduction there, but it won't be huge. Electricity is 19%, let's say 20% of our emissions are by our electricity, and if SaskPower is successful in reducing their emissions by 50% by 2030, we will see a significant drop there. Heavy industry, and that's the industry that's targeted by this bill, according to Prairie Resilience, is responsible for 4% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a lot of work going in to work on 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we currently have here in the province. And Mr. Speaker, I just hope we see action on the other 96% in the same way. We have agriculture for 24%, buildings at 4%, transportation at 14%, and currently those are referred to as non-regulated sectors. We know that we're regulating electricity, we're regulating oil and gas, we're regulating heavy industry, but that really is only half of the emissions that are being emitted in our province. We don't see anything coming forward from this government on the other 50%. And I don't know how long it will take, because the Prairie Resilience talks about a lot of this stuff: physical infrastructure, homes and buildings, technology, innovation. In terms of the upstream oil and gas, on page 9 of Prairie Resilience, they indicate they will develop regulations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from oil and gas wells and facilities using a results-based system, and we know how much these guys like the results-based system. That would provide each oil and gas operator the ability to efficiently prioritize emission reduction investments, and there's a number of other bullets there, but we don't get any targets. We don't get any promises in terms of how much their emissions will be reduced. And as we said before earlier, that many of them, even on page 11 of Prairie Resilience, in terms of the model of Saskatchewan Resilience Measure, we have all these specific measures, and yet there is absolutely no targets that are provided. So those blanks have to be filled in, Mr. Speaker, and this government's responsibility to do that. So hopefully we will get a sense of what those targets are going to look like before too long. Now, I do want to go through right now an MNP Myers Norris Penny report that was submitted to the government on April 23rd, 2018. And what we hear from them is a fairly comprehensive review of what happened when the government sat down with these heavy emitters. As you know, with Prairie Resilience, the number of heavy emitters was increased because the tonnage was reduced from 50,000 to 25,000, and that brought in a lot more heavy emitters into the mix or as they go forward. So MNP did a report. It's available on the government's webpage, and it sort of had some interesting points that I want to raise today in the House. So on page 4, I think it was a very telling comment, and I was a bit concerned about it because it indicated who was all invited and who came. There was a number of people that came from industry, but also from NGOs, and then it goes on to say the ministry will continue to seek out input from Indigenous leaders in the province, including the FSIN and the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. And I'm somewhat sad that they weren't involved in the initial discussions. I know the province has discussions with them from time to time, but that perspective is a really important one and probably should be included in any kind of consult with stakeholders, Mr. Speaker. So it's not clear to me why they weren't included in the sessions. When I look at the list of people who attended the sessions and provided written comments in Appendix 1, I didn't see any First Nations people or First Nations organization, but some of them I'm not totally familiar with. Maybe Whitecap Resources and MCE Consulting perhaps would be First Nations groups that were represented at the hearings and the people who participated. So there's also two, MNP indicated that there's two key draft documents that were circulated. Greenhouse gas reporting discussion paper and the Saskatchewan Climate Resilience Measurement Framework draft documents. Mr. Speaker, these documents are not available on the government website, so I think it would be helpful to have a look at them as well so we can understand how the consultation with the heavy emitters went, but they're currently not available on the government's website, so it would be helpful to have a look at those. Some of the things that came out of the summaries of key findings, MNP prepared a very thorough report. On page 6, one of the indicators there was industry repeatedly expressed a preference for a single regulator. And I think the idea that if the federal government was going to bring in regulations and then the provincial government was going to be in regulations, that would cause industry no end of headache and difficulty. So I guess if you throw in First Nation regulation as well, there's all kinds of even municipal regulation that could cause serious problems for industry. So that was one of the highlights or key findings from the engagement process, and that's in their executive summary. And there was a concern expressed from a number of stakeholders that noted the initial set of performance measures appear too complex. So there's a worry about the complexity of these. In terms of headings in the summary, there's number 1 is an overwhelming support for a made in Saskatchewan solution. I think that's something that we've advocated for on both sides of the House, Mr. Speaker. Number 2 is enabling the competitiveness of the Saskatchewan economy, and I think lots has been said about that as well, and ensuring that our trade exposed industries are not at risk economically. The third point was proactive leadership from Saskatchewan business and the importance of real reductions. So I think this acknowledges that many of our companies in Saskatchewan have already been proactive and have done a lot and everywhere they can to reduce their emissions. People are taking this seriously, Mr. Speaker. So people want meaningful emission reductions from all parties. The importance of flexibility, again, this was one of the key findings that came out of this report. So I guess we see a lot of flexibility in the bill right now because so much of it is driven by the regulatory sphere, and so we have to keep watching to see the results-based outcomes. I think is what was requested by industry, and I think every industry is different. So that's one of the challenges that's at play here, Mr. Speaker. Number 5, take a step-by-step approach to design and roll out a system. So I think the industry recognizes these timeframes the province is facing. January 1st is looming as a deadline. The federal backstop imposition would be something that's concerned to these folks. And so we see SaskPower is already under provincial regulation. We know that the methane regulations are coming, and so that's some flexibility that the government has managed to negotiate with the federal government. And then the technology fund here, they're suggesting it be an early priority. So offsets, many people suggested that wait to establish the offset system until year 2 or 3 of the program, once everybody understands what's going on, where their limits are, and how the regulatory regime is going to work. So that might be a good way to take a step-by-step approach to roll out the system. I don't think the government will be in a position to introduce the entire suite of regulations for this bill on January 1st. Obviously, there's a whole host of regulations that will need to come into play, and so they will need to obviously step by step the approach for sure. Number 6 was the important need to continue with solution mindsets and a focus on measures. So the challenge here is to focus on solutions, and it's funny, MNP said they encouraged all the participants to adopt a solution mindset, and they felt that the plenary meeting process, where people were sitting in a large group, did not allow anyone to get outside their speaking points, because each industry would have their speaking points. But they did feel that the bilateral sessions they held, which were much more confidential, allowed opportunity for more open discussion and sharing of proprietary and competitive data. And they said it was in this situation where the solution pathways began to emerge. So I think there's a confidence and trust on the part of the heavy emitter industries that needs to be built and encouraged as we move forward. And finally, the main point in their key summary findings was that there is optimism for solutions that balance the economy and the environment. Industry recognizes their role, and they feel that there are ways that a Made in Saskatchewan solution can be achieved that will offer that balance. People are committed to this. Stakeholders are committed to this and supportive of a solution-focused working relationship with the federal government. So there is a desire to see us move forward and not being in a divisive situation. So I think industry is on side with moving forward for sure. In terms of feedback on reporting and reporting thresholds, the ministry had originally proposed setting the reporting threshold at 25 kilotons of carbon dioxide emitted. So that's 25 kilotons. And then the regulated emitters would be regulated at the higher level. Following the release of the provincial strategy, the federal government announced it would establish a reporting threshold of 10 kilotons of carbon dioxide emitted. Although the proposed threshold for regulated emitters is 50 kilotons of carbon dioxide emitted. So I think I'm not sure I understand this, but I think what that will do is first of all, it will align with the federal threshold of 10 kilotons, but that's just for reporting only. I think regulated emitters would still kick in at 25 kilotons. So I think that will help and apparently has helped with the federal government's requirements and being able to stand down the federal government version of this type of legislation. MNP's summary on page 11 of the federal and provincial reporting is that feedback from participants was consistent and clear. A single window reporting platform is a key priority. And some of the opportunities they've identified there is the provincial government could actually establish a single window reporting system with the federal government. And that is something industry is hoping will happen. So that's one way of doing it. Or just equivalent reporting requirements that you just submit to the two levels of government. But don't make people work harder than they have to on this. I mentioned this earlier, Mr. Speaker, but people are worried about who the qualified person is that will be deciding what your emission levels are and whether you're emitting over that level. And what they heard at page 11 here is this: the verification of emissions by an independent third party is believed to be an important part of the program's design to ensure transparency and accountability by regulated emitters. Regulated emitters, associations, NGOs, and other participants recognize the necessity for third-party verification. Now, participants raised concerns about the potential complexity and level of detail associated with third-party verification and the corresponding cost to comply. This was of particular concern to smaller emitters in the province who may be required to report. I'm going to make it. Oh, sweet. Yeah. So smaller emitters are very concerned about the complexity and detail, and I think that is a real a real concern that is going to have to be dealt with because this is such a complex system, Mr. Speaker. The ministry apparently, at the top of page 12, the ministry shared with all the participants that the requirements for a third-party verifier were specifically defined in the regulations now covering Sask Power, including registration as a professional engineer, plus certification through CSA. Now, there's no guarantee that those same standards will be placed on the heavy emitters, but I think that's the implication you could take away from that. So the summary that MNP has on page 12 is that reliability and confidence in the reporting of emission results is a cornerstone of the climate change program. The reliability and confidence in the reporting. And there's we'll have a diverse mix of qualified professionals and with the technical skills that are needed for verification. So one of the recommendations that MNP made to the ministry was as follows: define a range of professionals to be qualified to verify emission levels and establish a requirement for CSA or ISO certification for verifiers. So this is really important, and again, Mr. Speaker, we won't get an opportunity to comment on these qualifications because they are very clearly going to be part of the regulatory scheme the regulatory scheme that the government is going to implement sometime after the legislation is in place. But obviously it's very important to the heavy emitters, and we have to ensure that it will be properly identified and dealt with in the regulations. In terms of performance standards, stringency levels, and emission baselines, that's the next heading at page 13 of the report. I like that. I think the key note here is there were diverse viewpoints shared through the plenary sessions with regards to how performance standards should be established and where stringency levels should be set. Mr. Speaker, I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road, is where is the stringency standard and where are the performance standards. And obviously there will be diverse opinions on that, so I'm not sure how the government's going to approach that and how they're going to bring it into balance. But I think that's one of the major challenges that the government's facing right now. There were talks about specific sector compliance, and this is where we've talked about that a little bit earlier, but SAS Power is committed to a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030 and are now under provincial regulation. And the government, it says, has been working with the upstream oil and gas sector in the province to pursue methane reductions in the 40 to 45% range. I don't know how that accounts for our total emissions, Mr. Speaker, and we certainly don't know when we're going to see those regulations and when the actual reductions will start. Hopefully that will be, as I said earlier, sooner than later, because we know how destructive and deadly the methane reductions are to greenhouse gas emissions and our atmosphere. Interesting, and they identify this as a unique consideration, but the landfills in both the City of Regina and City of Saskatoon have large enough emissions to be classified as a regulated emitter. So I think that may be a bit of a surprise. It was a surprise to me that there's enough emissions in the two major city landfills to qualify them as a regulated emitter. And both of the cities were part of the discussion and said they would prefer to be provincially regulated but exempted from compliance and emission reductions. And you might ask, well, why would they be exempted? If they're a heavy emitter, they're a heavy emitter. And their rationale was that a landfill, unlike a production facility with energy input, a landfill has an existing base that will consistently produce emissions, and there's no option to turn the source for emissions on or off. You can't turn off garbage, Mr. Speaker. It continues to emit. And so, in addition to not being regulated, though, they would like the option to be able to qualify for offsets through expanded use of methane capture facilities. And I talked about that earlier as well. The City of Saskatoon now has a methane power production plant that they're using methane from the garbage to generate electricity. So, interesting kind of unique situation. Another group that is also asking for special consideration is the ethanol producers in the province, and they're saying that they would like to be considered excluded from regulation as well. And you're wondering, okay, well, they're emitting, why would they be excluded? The rationale is that biofuel is mandated and that the net emissions offset far exceeds their total emissions from production. So another argument that was made for people to be exempted from the regime. So the summary that on this section that the MNP identified in terms of designing the program, flexible approach for establishing baseline emission levels. So again, we don't know what the baseline emission levels are going to look like. It may very well be there will be a flexible approach depending on the industry, or by the sector, or even potentially by the facility. and data-based approach that is publicly defensible will be critical. Key opportunities, the ministry can consider a few things. Flexible approaches for establishing baseline emission levels and stringency levels. I think that's something that might be challengeable, and it's really sort of hard when you've got apples and oranges and pears and bananas and you're trying to treat them all fairly. So that's, I think, one of the particular challenges of this approach. And then following additional conversations with regulated emitters, consider the potential to define an overall targeted reduction level. I believe the overall targeted reduction level is that 1.1% of our overall emissions. So it looks like that work has happened. Consider potential exemptions for landfills and the ethanol sector, and we don't have that information to date from the ministry whether they've accepted that as potential exemptions or not. And again, I think we'll have to see it in the regulations, as far as I understand. Now, regulatory stacking, we talked about that a little bit already, but really that was one of the key requirements or requests of the industry, was to avoid regulatory stacking. And what there was a lot of frustration and concern expressed about this. So the first piece is, of course, as SaskPower goes ahead with its commitment to renewables, there will be, the trend line is there for rate increases with SaskPower. So that's something that is seen as regulatory stacking. Also, because electricity is a large input cost for many of the emitters, there's a potential implications of electricity costs on competitiveness. Also, the pass-through costs of emissions compliance on natural gas and the rate structure from Sask Energy, which we know will come out. Also, there's this clean fuel standard being proposed by the federal government. That's not something I know a lot about, but they're seeing that as a stacking of regulations. And then the growing divide in tax rates and regulatory burden between Canada and the United States was highlighted by many stakeholders. Investment capital is mobile, as we all know. So they were cautioning governments in Canada to be conscious and aware of the cumulative effects of regulatory compliance. So those are real concerns. What MNP is recommending to the government is that they do a competitive impact analysis that would estimate the potential cumulative cost to the Saskatchewan economy for the climate change program and other various regulatory changes. And this is something we don't know whether the government has done yet or not, but certainly we'll want to find out from at committee and perhaps get those documents if that competitive impact analysis has been completed, or if it hasn't been, will it be, and if it's not going to be, why not, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the compliance options, there were key themes that came out of compliance, and one was emission quantification. And as you can imagine, Mr. Speaker, emission quantification is one of the most complex issues, I think, in this area. There was a number of concerns raised about the lack of flexibility regarding the allocation of environmental attributes in contracts with SaskPower. And I'm not really sure exactly what that would refer to, but if they're, I guess what it is emitters who are already investing capital dollars into collaborative projects with SaskPower, that may be the Shan Power Station, or I think BHP has some cogeneration. I'm not sure who has cogeneration projects right now with SaskPower, but would those be able to be counted or not? And those who are investing capital dollars into see that as a high priority. So I guess those are what you call environmental attributes. And so that's one of the options or key opportunities that MNP is recommending the ministry to consider, is explore with SaskPower what are the value and opportunities to negotiate allocation of environmental attributes. And I think that's a win-win story when you see energy that would otherwise be emitted into the atmosphere being captured and then converted into electricity. It's an interesting and positive consideration. Page 19, there's a long discussion starting on the technology fund itself as proposed in the legislation, the new technology fund. And The ministry, I think, repeatedly reminded the emitters that the potential size of the technology fund asset pool is expected to be significantly less than the original design. This is on page 19 of the report. And they explain why. It's because of two important policy developments. First, SAS Power, as of January 2018, is now under provincial regulation and is limited from contributing to the technology fund in order to focus investments on renewables. So that's a significant change from the 2009-2012 version of the bill. Secondly, the upstream oil and gas sector is expected to have its methane emissions covered under a separate regulatory process being developed by the Ministry of Energy and Resources plus industry. And again, I think this raises some of the concerns that we see where the Ministry of Environment is not involved in the regulation of methane and in the regulation of the oil and gas industry as a whole, and that's part of that regulatory stacking issue as well, I would submit, Mr. Speaker, because we are talking about stacking between the feds and the province, but we've got two ministries that may be working at different levels and different purposes, and I think it would be important that the oil and gas upstream sector, in terms of emissions, be regulated by the same ministry that is regulating emissions for the rest of the province. But as it stands right now, it's two separate ministries. And of course, none of the Ministry of Energy and Resources, any funds that come out of the reduction through the methane is not going to go into the technology fund. So those are two very large sectors, emitters that would significantly impact the technology fund as it was originally contemplated. One of the things that came out of the discussions was considerable interest by the emitters to have sort of a separate bank account in the technology fund. In the bottom of page 19, MNP says this: through this recent engagement process, we heard from regulated emitters that there is more interest in direct access to compliance dollars than tax deductibility. The majority of regulated emitters would want the ability to deposit a segregated amount into the technology fund. Based on clear criteria and a clear process, they would want to have direct access back to their compliance levies to fund qualifying projects. And some participants even said that there should be a time limit placed on access to dollars. So I find that really interesting. So again, in terms of access, the technology fund should be exclusive to those who contribute the funds. And they're very clear about that. And again, we see in the structure of the regulation making of powers that other monies could be placed into the fund. So I'm not sure if monies that are appropriated by the government should be available exclusively to these technology fund emitters, or whether that would be something that could maybe be looked at in a different way. See, and then the converse of that, Mr. Speaker, was the NGO and the non-regulated sectors, so building trades and transportation. Alternatively, the NGO and non-regulated sectors indicated that they want access to a portion of the technology fund resources to achieve emission reductions in the broader economy or provincial community. And so I think it's a bit of a balance one way or the other, and it'll be interesting to see which way the government goes. Once we know that, then we'll be able to have more comment on it. But at this point, we don't know exactly how that's going to happen until we see how the technology fund is created. Another bullet in terms of access was this, Mr. Speaker. There were a number of practical questions raised about how large the pool of funds may actually be when both SAS Power and upstream oil and gas possibly exempted from using the technology fund. So this is where the other compliance options come in. Regulated emitters are anticipated to have other compliance options as well, which could diminish the amount collected. So there's foreseeably, Mr. Speaker, the possibility that there may be no money in the technology fund because SAS Power is gone, upstream oil and gas is gone, and if people choose these compliance options other than contributing cash, it may very well be that there's absolutely no money coming into the tech fund because of the way it's been structured. So that creates a problem if you want to use a technology fund to design innovative and carbon-reducing technologies. It's going to be a problem. In the summary that MMP has on the bottom of page 20, they're talking about the governance and the leadership model of the technology fund. It needs to be reviewed and updated, and the potential size and scope of the technology fund has definitely changed. So there's growing interest for the technology fund to operate more on the deposit model than a pooled model, allowing regulated emitters the options to have direct access to the dollars they contribute. So these are the following recommendations to the Ministry from MNP. And the Ministry may consider the following opportunities in the design of the program. Review and update the governance and leadership of the Technology Fund. Identify the governance structure and composition for the fund. Consider whether funds should be an assigned deposit or pooled. Assess the value for completing a new advanced tax ruling with the Canada Revenue Agency. Establishment of project principles and criteria, plus approval processes for how dollars are accessed from the fund. Consider the option for pre-certified investments that could permit compliance funds being invested directly into qualifying emission reduction projects. Confirm what types of projects would qualify for technology fund support, and determine who would have access to the resources of the technology fund. So, Mr. Speaker, that's a long list. And I think it highlights a lot of the work that the government has ahead of them when they're finally sitting down to establish the technology fund. And again, we will look upon that with great interest when we are able to see what they've decided they're going to do. The next heading in the MNP review on page 21 is performance credits. And this is a new piece that we're just starting to hear about now, Mr. Speaker. One of the bullets I highlighted here was that there was high interest from regulated emitters for the ability to have access to performance credits. Different things were said about the bankability of performance credits, and there were not specific conversations about the design of the credit exchange system between the regulated emitters. However, MNP does have a couple recommendations for the Ministry, and one is to determine whether a time limit or cap would be placed on the use of these performance credits, and the second would be the design of an efficient, technology-based solution to track and report on performance credit accrual, use, and allocation and trading. So those are two really important aspects, I think, Mr. Speaker, in terms of how these performance credits will be created and used. But how long would they be good for? 5 years, 2 years, 10 years? If you don't use it, do you lose it? And that's one of the things that needs to be considered. And then a technology-based solution to track and report on accrual, use, allocation, trading. So you can see the many complexities that would come straight out of that one aspect, which is the performance credits, which is something that is new in this version of the Act and certainly wasn't well articulated back in 2009.
It now being 5 p.m., this House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pretty impressive, Nutana.